My husband auctioned me for $5 in front of 300 elite guests. Who wants this useless wife? He mocked, his voice booming over the microphone as the grand ballroom burst into roaring laughter. I stayed completely silent. I just stood there, the butt of a cruel public joke, until a cold, commanding voice suddenly cut through the deafening noise from the very back of the room. "I will pay $1 million for her." The laughter vanished instantly. The air was sucked out of the room, because the man who made that staggering offer was the one person my husband feared the most. The crystal chandeliers of the Waldorf Astoria cast a blinding fractured light across the sea of tailored tuxedos and designer gowns. The air was thick with the suffocating scents of expensive champagne roasted truffles and the heavy musky cologne of Wall Street investors. I am 32 years old, standing in the shadows of a room I literally helped buy, wearing a modest navy evening gown that cost less than the caviar appetizers being passed around on silver trays. My name is Ava. 5 years ago, I was a rising financial analyst at a top-tier corporate firm in Manhattan. I had a corner office in my sights, a robust stock portfolio, and a reputation for being ruthless with numbers. But I traded all of that for a cramped dining room table in a one-bedroom apartment so I could build Derek and his tech logistics startup from the ground up. I crunched the late-night data, secured the initial high-risk loans by putting my own premarital savings on the line, and pitched to our very first clients, while Derek stood in front of the bathroom mirror practicing his charismatic chief executive officer smile. Now that little startup was a multi-million-dollar enterprise, poised for a massive venture capital buyout, and I had been systematically reduced to Derek and his silent, underestimated shadow. He liked to tell his wealthy peers that I preferred staying home, that I was a traditional housewife managing the domestic sphere, keeping things quiet. The brutal truth was that he had systematically pushed me out the exact moment the first massive venture capital check cleared. He changed the passwords to the company ledgers, hired flashy new executives, and made sure he absorbed the spotlight entirely for himself. Tonight was supposed to be his crowning achievement, a lavish charity gala to woo the remaining titans of the tech industry before a major merger. I stood near the back corner by the exit doors, nursing a glass of sparkling water with lime, trying my best to remain completely invisible to the crowd. My sister-in-law, Maya, a brilliant African-American corporate lawyer who had always seen right through her brother and his inflated ego and fragile masculinity, had warned me this would happen. Earlier this evening, Maya had pulled me aside adjusting her sleek blazer and whispered that Derek was getting completely drunk on his own arrogance. She warned me that his desperation for validation from these billionaires was turning him into a monster and that I needed to protect myself. I watched him now on the grand stage, his face flushed, a crystal tumbler of single malt scotch swaying dangerously in his right hand. He was slurring his words slightly, basking in the rapt adoration of 300 venture capitalists, eager socialites, and wealthy tech founders. He was supposed to be auctioning off a vintage sports car for the evening charity drive. The room was buzzing with anticipation. Instead, his glassy, bloodshot eyes scanned the crowd, bypassing the wealthy donors, and locked directly onto my quiet corner. A cruel, twisted smirk crawled across his face. Before I could turn away or blend into the velvet curtains, he pointed a sharp finger straight at me. "Why do not we auction off something truly high maintenance tonight?" he shouted into the microphone, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The technician, thinking it was part of a planned routine, swung the massive spotlight violently in my direction. The bright white beam blinded me, pinning me against the dark mahogany-paneled wall like a captured animal. "Come on up here, Ava. Do not be shy," Derek sneered. The crowd parted instantly like the Red Sea. Whispers rippled through the sea of silk and tuxedos. My heart pounded violently against my ribs, a frantic, terrifying rhythm that made my chest physically ache. I froze, my legs turning to solid lead, but the heavy, expectant gazes of 300 people forced me forward. I walked up the velvet-lined steps to the stage, my hands trembling uncontrollably at my sides. Derek grabbed my shoulder, his fingers digging painfully tight into my skin, yanking me toward the absolute center of the stage. He leaned heavily into the microphone, his breath reeking of expensive scotch and foul intentions. "Let us start the bidding for this useless stay-at-home charity case," he slurred loudly, gesturing to me as if I were a piece of defective property. Who will give me $5 for a wife who does nothing but drain my bank account and complain? Roaring laughter erupted from the crowd. It crashed over me like a massive physical wave, suffocating dense and unimaginably heavy. Men in $1,000 suits chuckled, while swirling their bourbon women covered their mouths with perfectly manicured hands, their eyes dripping with a toxic mix of pity and morbid amusement. Every single chuckle felt like a physical blow to my chest. The isolation was absolute. I stood completely paralyzed under the hot lights. A chill ran down my spine, freezing the blood in my veins. The stench of his alcohol mixed with the scent of my own sheer panic. The man I had sacrificed my entire career. For the man whose shimmering empire was built directly on the foundation of my sleepless nights. My financial genius and my exhausted tears was selling my dignity for a cheap laugh in front of the most powerful people in the city. The applause from his sycophants pounded in my ears, drowning out my own racing thoughts. I stared out at the sea of mocking, blurry faces, the deep humiliation burning my cheeks like physical fire. I was unable to breathe, unable to scream, entirely trapped in the agonizing pain of a public execution of my pride. The deafening roar of 300 wealthy elites laughing at my expense felt like physical blows raining down on my chest. I stood frozen under the blinding heat of the stage spotlight, the air completely sucked out of my lungs. Derek tightened his grip on my shoulder, his heavy gold watch digging into my collarbone as he leaned into the microphone, soaking in the cruel amusement of the crowd. He was waiting for a bid. He was waiting for one of his arrogant tech buddies to throw out a crumpled $5 bill, just to complete the humiliating punchline. In the front row, I could clearly see Vanessa, his flashy vice president of public relations, covering her mouth to hide a malicious smirk. The entire grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria was a swirling vortex of expensive champagne, glittering diamonds, and absolute betrayal. I closed my eyes, wishing the polished mahogany floor would simply open up and swallow me whole. My hands trembled violently against the cheap fabric of my modest navy gown. I had never felt so painfully small, so utterly worthless. Then a voice sliced through the toxic symphony of laughter. "I will pay $1 million for her." The words were not shouted. They were spoken with a cold, terrifyingly calm authority that commanded immediate and absolute obedience. The sound did not echo. It struck the room like a physical shockwave. In a fraction of a second, the roaring laughter was instantly extinguished. The silence that slammed into the ballroom was so absolute, so suffocating, that I could hear the faint clinking of ice melting inside the crystal glasses of the guests closest to the stage. Men in custom-tailored suits stopped breathing. Women lowered their manicured hands, their mocking smiles freezing into masks of utter confusion and shock. The sudden shift in the atmosphere was violent and immediate. Derek flinched as if he had been slapped across the face. His fingers instantly went slack, dropping from my shoulder as he desperately scanned the back of the room. At the very back of the grand ballroom, the sea of wealthy investors instinctively parted. They stepped back, practically climbing over each other, to clear a wide, unobstructed path down the center aisle. No one dared to block the way. The crowd parted as if making way for royalty. Stepping out of the shadows was Victor Thorne. Even in a room filled with the most powerful tech founders and venture capitalists in modern American society, Victor operated on an entirely different stratosphere. He was notoriously reclusive, a ruthless titan of venture capital who dismantled failing corporations and devoured startups for breakfast. He was the white whale Derek had been desperately hunting for the past 8 months. Derek needed Victor Thorne's $50 million investment to save his logistics company from a looming catastrophic bankruptcy. Without Victor, Derek was financially dead. Everyone in the room knew it. Derek had spent the entire evening desperately trying to catch Victor's eye, practically begging for 2 minutes of his time. Victor had ignored him completely, until this exact moment. Victor walked down the cleared aisle with slow, measured steps. His presence radiated an aura of absolute terrifying power. He wore a midnight black bespoke suit that moved flawlessly with his athletic frame. His face was angular, carved from stone, and his dark eyes were as sharp as a knife. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at Vanessa, whose jaw had practically unhinged in shock as she watched her carefully constructed reality begin to fracture. He kept his piercing gaze locked entirely on me. As he approached the stage, the sheer weight of his presence made the air in the room feel heavy and dense. My heart pounded so violently I thought my ribs would crack. A chill raced down my spine, but it was no longer born of humiliation. It was shock. Pure, unadulterated shock. I caught a glimpse of my sister-in-law Maya standing near the velvet curtains. Mio, a brilliant African-American corporate lawyer who tolerated zero nonsense, had her eyes wide, a slow, triumphant realization dawning on her face. She knew exactly what this meant for her arrogant brother. Derek scrambled to recover his shattered ego. He nervously wiped the sweat forming on his forehead, his charismatic facade crumbling into a pathetic display of panic. He forced out a breathless, trembling chuckle, desperately trying to salvage the moment and his precious investment deal. "Mr. Thorne," Derek stammered into the microphone, his voice cracking horribly. "I am so honored you could join us." This was just a bit of lighthearted entertainment for the crowd. A joke between husband and wife, really. You do not need to play along. Victor did not stop walking. He ascended the short velvet stairs to the stage. He did not acknowledge Derek's desperate rambling. He did not even look at him. Victor moved with the terrifying grace of an apex predator. He stopped precisely 2 feet away from us. The height difference was marginal, but Victor seemed to tower over my husband, completely dwarfing Derek's fragile, alcohol-soaked masculinity. The tension on the stage was thick enough to cut with a knife. "I said I will pay $1 million, Victor repeated. His voice was low, yet it carried to the furthest corners of the dead silent room. Victor reached into the inner pocket of his immaculate suit jacket. He withdrew a sleek silver fountain pen and a leather-bound checkbook. Without breaking eye contact with Derek, Victor quickly scrawled his signature across a perfectly crisp check. He tore it from the binding with a sharp, fatal sound that echoed over the microphone. Derek stood completely paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked down at the paper. It was a certified personal check for $1 million written out to cash. For the merchandise, Victor said, his tone dripping with an icy, lethal contempt. Victor thrust the check directly against Derek's chest. Derek instinctively fumbled to catch the paper, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. The absolute humiliation washing over my husband was palpable. The powerful, brilliant chief executive officer was reduced to a trembling, pathetic servant in front of the exact elite investors he was trying to impress. His face flushed a deep, shameful red as the reality of his mistake settled in. Victor turned his attention to me. The coldness in his eyes instantly softened, replaced by something deep and indecipherable. He reached out his large, warm hand. My own hand was shaking uncontrollably, but I slowly raised it. The moment his fingers wrapped firmly around mine, a surge of grounding energy rushed through my body. His grip was protective, solid, and safe. "We are leaving," Victor stated softly, speaking only to me. He did not wait for my response. He gently but firmly pulled me away from Derek, leading me down the stage steps. The 300 guests stood frozen like statues, completely dumbfounded by the unprecedented scene unfolding before them. Whispers began to erupt like a rising tide, but this time the toxic amusement was completely gone. The hushed, frantic voices were aimed entirely at Derek. They were questioning his sanity, his business acumen, and his deeply fatal mistake of publicly insulting a woman that Victor Thorne valued at $1 million. I kept my head held high, my hand locked in Victor's as he escorted me straight out of the grand ballroom, leaving my husband drowning in a sea of his own absolute panic and undeniable ruin. The heavy, reinforced door of the black town car slammed shut instantly, severing us from the blinding flashes and the suffocating noise of the grand ballroom. The silence inside the spacious cabin was absolute and terrifying. The plush leather seats felt cold against my bare shoulders as the vehicle glided seamlessly away from the curb and merged into the bustling Manhattan traffic. The city lights blurred into long streaks of gold and crimson through the tinted windows, washing over the sharp angles of Victor Thorne sitting right beside me. I sat completely frozen, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My breathing was painfully shallow. I was waiting for him to speak, waiting for some sort of explanation. Some romantic platitude, or a look of pity for the humiliated woman he had just purchased in front of 300 elite guests. But Victor offered absolutely none of that. He did not look at me with sympathy. He did not ask if I was okay. Instead, he stared straight ahead at the passing city skyline, his posture radiating a cold, impenetrable authority. The space between us was thick with tension. I nervously smoothed the cheap fabric of my navy gown, feeling entirely out of place in the immaculate luxury of his vehicle. The lingering stench of my husband's scotch and the cruel roaring laughter of the crowd still echoed violently in my ears. I felt a chill run down my spine as Victor finally turned his head to look at me. His gaze was as sharp as a newly honed knife, completely stripping away the naive facade I had been wearing all night. "You are blindingly loyal to a man who considers you entirely disposable," Victor said. His voice was low, devoid of any warmth, delivering the brutal truth with the precision of a surgeon. I opened my mouth to defend my husband, to offer some pathetic excuse for the auction, but the words died in my throat. Victor reached into the inner pocket of his bespoke suit jacket and withdrew a small, sleek silver flash drive. He held it out to me. The metal caught the passing streetlights, gleaming with a dangerous promise. I stared at it, my hands trembling uncontrollably in my lap. "I did not intervene tonight out of charity." Victor continued, his tone remaining perfectly flat and professional. "I intervened because I despise arrogance, and Derek is drowning in it. Your husband has been aggressively courting my firm for a $50 million investment to save his logistics company from total collapse. He claims his financials are pristine. He claims his business model is revolutionary. But numbers never lie, Ava. People do." I slowly reached out my fingers, brushing against his warm skin as I took the silver drive. It felt unimaginably heavy in my palm. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice cracking under the crushing weight of the moment. "It is the truth," Victor replied simply. "You sacrificed your career to build his empire. You gave him your premarital savings. You worked the grueling late nights. Yet you have no equity, no voting rights, and no access to the master ledgers. You are being played for a fool, Ava. Open those files when you are completely alone. Then you must decide if you want to remain a victim or if you want to take back the life you built." The car slowed to a smooth halt in front of the towering wrought iron gates of the sprawling suburban estate Derek and I currently shared. It was a massive, cold, modern architectural marvel that I spent hours decorating, trying to turn it into a warm home for the children Derek kept saying we would have someday. Now, looking at the dark windows, it just looked like a beautifully constructed prison. The driver opened my door, letting in the cool night air. I stepped out onto the paved driveway, clutching the silver drive so tightly, the metal edges dug painfully into my skin. I looked back at Victor. He gave me a single decisive nod before the heavy door clicked shut, and the sleek car disappeared into the darkness, leaving me entirely alone with a terrifying seed of doubt taking root deeply in my chest. I walked through the grand entryway of the house, kicking off my uncomfortable heels. The marble floor was freezing beneath my bare feet. The silence of the empty mansion was deafening. I walked into the dark living room and sank onto the expansive velvet sofa. I did not turn on the lights. I just sat in the pitch black, staring blindly ahead. The agonizing pain of the public auction replayed over and over in my mind. "Who wants this useless wife?" The words echoed relentlessly. I thought about the past 5 years, the grueling sacrifices, the absolute trust I had handed Derek on a silver platter. I had believed him when he said he needed to lock me out of the company accounts for legal protection. I had believed him when he said he was working late at the office every single night. The sickening realization that I had willingly blinded myself began to crawl up my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. My mind was spinning violently. Was Victor manipulating me? Or was the man I loved a complete monster? 3 grueling hours passed in the suffocating darkness before the heavy front door finally crashed open. Derek stumbled into the foyer, his footsteps heavy and uncoordinated. He flicked on the bright overhead lights, blinding me for a moment. He looked absolutely livid. His expensive tuxedo jacket was thrown carelessly over his arm. His bow tie was undone, and his hair was an unkempt mess. As he stomped into the living room, the overwhelming stench of premium scotch and the sickeningly sweet floral perfume that his vice president Vanessa always wore hit me like a physical wave. My stomach churned violently at the scent. He stopped when he saw me sitting on the sofa. His bloodshot eyes widened, his face flushing a deep, furious red. "Are you out of your mind?" Derek shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. He threw his jacket onto a nearby armchair and began pacing frantically across the rug. "Do you have any idea what you just did to me? You completely humiliated me in front of the entire board. You made me look like an absolute fool." I stared at him, my heart hammering a terrified rhythm. "I humiliated you," I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You auctioned me for $5. You called me a useless charity case in front of 300 people. It was a joke, Ava," he roared, throwing his hands in the air with dramatic exasperation. He marched over to me, leaning down so his furious face was mere inches from mine. It was a simple icebreaker. I was working the crowd. Those investors expect a performance. They expect confidence. You are always so damn sensitive, so completely dramatic. You ruined the entire climax of my pitch because you could not handle a tiny bit of spotlight. The blatant gaslighting made my head spin. He was twisting reality seamlessly, turning his cruel public abuse into my personal failure. I looked at the man I had married, really looked at him. The handsome, charismatic facade was slipping, revealing the frantic, ugly desperation underneath. He began to rub his temples vigorously, pacing the floor again like a cornered animal. Then, the true reason for his panic finally surfaced. "Victor Thorne actually took you out of the building," Derek muttered, mostly to himself, a frantic energy taking over his movements. "Thorne never interacts with anyone. He has been dodging my calls for 8 months. And he walked right up to the stage for you." Derek suddenly stopped pacing. The furious red color drained from his face, replaced by a calculating, greedy gleam in his eyes. His entire demeanor shifted in a split second. The angry tyrant vanished, and the manipulative charmer magically reappeared. He walked back to the sofa and dropped to his knees right in front of me. He reached out and grabbed my trembling hands, squeezing them with entirely fake affection. "Ava, listen to me," Derek pleaded, his voice dropping into that smooth, persuasive tone he used to close major deals. "I am sorry about the joke. Okay, I took it too far. The pressure is just killing me. The company is at a critical juncture, and if we do not get this funding, we lose everything we have built, everything you helped me build. But Thorne likes you. He actually paid attention to you." A fresh wave of nausea washed over me. He was not apologizing for hurting me. He was apologizing because he needed something. "You have a connection with him now," Derek continued, completely ignoring the tears welling in my eyes. "You need to call him. You need to leverage whatever bizarre fascination he has with you to secure that $50 million investment. You owe me this, Ava. You embarrassed me tonight, but you can fix it. You can save our future. Just play nice with him, get the deal signed. And I promise things will go back to normal." I looked down at his hands clutching mine. The platinum wedding band glinted under the harsh living room lights. Just hours ago, I would have melted at his apology. I would have blamed myself for being too sensitive. I would have eagerly agreed to do whatever it took to save his company, believing we were a united front. I was the sincere, enduring wife who always fixed his messes. But his hands felt like heavy chains pulling me down into a dark, suffocating ocean. The sickening scent of Vanessa clinging to his shirt collar burned my nose. The cold, hard metal of the silver flash drive rested heavily inside the hidden pocket of my gown, a terrifying reminder of Victor Thorne and his chilling words. "You are being played for a fool." The naive, submissive girl who had sacrificed her entire career for this man died quietly right there on the velvet sofa. In her place, a profound, steely clarity began to form. The devastating seed of betrayal had completely taken root, spreading its dark vines through my chest, entirely choking out any remaining trust I had for the man kneeling before me. I slowly raised my head and looked directly into his desperate, bloodshot eyes. I forced the muscles in my face to relax carefully, wiping away the shock and the heartbreak. I summoned every ounce of self-control I had learned from years of navigating high-stakes financial audits. I offered him a soft, reassuring, and completely submissive smile. "I understand, Derek," I murmured, keeping my voice gentle and obedient. "I am sorry for overreacting. I will call Mr. Thorne first thing tomorrow morning. I will do whatever it takes to secure your investment." He let out a massive sigh of relief. He kissed my forehead, completely blind to the fact that his perfect, compliant wife was already planning his absolute destruction. He stumbled upstairs to bed, leaving me alone once more. I sat perfectly still in the quiet room. My heart was no longer racing in panic. It was beating with a slow, deliberate, and entirely lethal purpose. The game had changed. The morning sunlight filtered through the heavy linen curtains of our master bedroom. It cast a bright, blinding glow across the hardwood floor that felt completely out of place against the dark, heavy dread settling in my chest. I sat on the edge of the mattress, staring blankly at the wall. The agonizing pain from the gala last night still burned fiercely in my veins. My husband Derek was in the master bathroom. The rhythmic sound of the shower running echoed through the quiet house. He was washing away the stench of expensive scotch and the sweat of his arrogant triumph. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I rubbed my aching temples, trying to process the absolute humiliation he had subjected me to in front of 300 elite guests. I had sacrificed my entire career for him. I truly loved him with all my broken heart. I built his massive tech logistics startup from our cramped dining room table. And he had auctioned me off for $5 like a piece of defective property. He claimed it was just a joke to win over the venture capitalists. He gaslit me until I nodded and played the submissive wife. But the seed of doubt Victor Thorne planted in my mind was growing rapidly into a thorny, suffocating vine. As I sat there suffocating in the silence, a sudden sharp chime shattered the quiet room. It was a text message notification. I turned my head and looked at his old silver device resting on the mahogany nightstand. Derek had abandoned that tablet months ago, claiming it was too slow for his important executive work. He used it solely for reading news articles before bed, but he had forgotten one crucial tiny detail. He was an incredibly careless man. He had completely forgotten to log out of his cloud account and disable the data synchronization. The screen illuminated the dim corner of the room. I stared at the glowing rectangle. My heart began to pound violently against my ribs. A terrifying premonition crawled up my throat. I had never invaded his privacy in our 5 years of marriage. I had offered him my absolute trust and silent sacrifice. But today was very different. The naive girl who blindly believed her husband died on that gala stage last night. I took a deep, long breath. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I reached out and picked up the cold metal device. I swiped the screen to unlock it. He had never bothered to change the simple 4-digit passcode. The messaging application opened instantly. What I saw on that glowing screen hit me like a massive physical blow. It hurt deeply. The air was violently sucked out of my aching lungs. The most recent conversation thread was at the very top. The contact name was saved simply as the name Vanessa. Vanessa was his flashy vice president of public relations now. She was the woman who wore suffocatingly sweet floral perfume. She always stood a little too close to him then. I scrolled up with a shaking finger to read more. The sheer volume of these messages was completely staggering now. It was an endless stream of digital betrayal and lies. They were not discussing marketing strategies or boring press releases. They were exchanging intense, intimate texts about a secret life. This secret life spanned 2 entire years behind my back. While I was craning my neck over spreadsheets every night, I balanced the corporate ledgers to keep his company afloat. Derek was booking luxury hotel suites and buying expensive jewelry. The silent room began to spin in a dizzying circle. A blinding ringing noise filled my ears with agonizing pain. I read messages where he called her his beautiful soulmate. My chest tightened painfully as I absorbed every vile word. I forced myself to keep reading past the romantic lies. Every single sentence felt like a serrated, twisting hunting knife. I scrolled further down the glowing screen and stopped abruptly. There was a high-resolution photo attachment sent by Vanessa. She sent it late last night during the charity gala. I tapped the blurry image to enlarge it right away. It was a positive pregnancy blood test confirming everything clearly. Below the document, Vanessa had sent a deeply disturbing picture. It featured a tiny pair of blue designer infant shoes. She wrote a sickening message directly beneath the bright photo. "Our little heir is growing so incredibly fast now, baby. I cannot wait until we do not have to hide." Derek had replied to her message almost immediately last night. Junior is going to have the absolute best life ever. Just be patient, gorgeous, because we are almost fully ready. The final pieces of our plan are falling into place. A profound freezing chill ran rapidly down my stiff spine. The cruel betrayal was not just emotional or merely physical. They were actively building a completely new family together now. They built it directly upon the foundation of my ruin. He wanted to completely replace me with another young woman. He was going to raise a child with his mistress. The vile texts continued downward, revealing even darker hidden secrets. I read the terrible messages they exchanged during the gala. Vanessa had cruelly texted him directly from the front row. "You really put the charity case in her place tonight. Selling her for $5 was absolutely brilliant and hilarious." Derek had replied exactly 2 minutes later with sheer malice. "She is just a useless, naive workhorse holding me back. I squeezed her for all the startup capital I could. I took her free labor, and now she is dead weight. As soon as I secure Thorne and his $50 million, we will instantly trigger the corporate bankruptcy and walk away. She signed the loan guarantor papers because she is gullible. She will be entirely buried in massive federal tax debt. We will be drinking expensive champagne in sunny, beautiful Paris. I will toss her out with absolutely nothing left inside." My blood ran completely cold inside my trembling physical body. The agonizing pain in my chest vanished without a trace. The hot tears stinging my eyes dried up very quickly. I was not just a painfully discarded wife to him. I was the designated scapegoat for a massive fraud scheme. They were sitting right in front of me, plotting maliciously. They wanted to completely destroy my entire financial existence permanently. I took a deep, steadying breath and calmed my nerves. My hand stopped trembling as a new resolve washed over. The shattered, heartbroken woman was gone forever from this world. In her place, a cold, calculating, and steely demeanor grew. I stared at the bathroom door, listening to running water. There would be absolutely no loud, meaningless, jealous domestic scenes. I was going to use my sharp intellect against him. I would use the law to utterly obliterate his life. I began to quietly take screenshots of every single message. I forwarded the damning images to a secure hidden folder. I captured the pregnancy test and all the cruel jokes. I saved the detailed discussions of corporate fraud and theft. Every image was another solid nail in his beautiful coffin. I made sure to gather enough solid evidence against him. I proved his malicious intent beyond any shadow of doubt. I wiped the glowing screen completely clean of my fingerprints. I carefully placed the silver device back on the nightstand. It rested exactly where he had left it last night. I stood up from the bed and walked away quietly. I moved over to the large mirror on the door. The reflection staring back at me was pale but resolute. I smoothed the wrinkles from my simple dark silk robe. My mind raced with numbers, ledgers, and complex legal clauses. I knew his business inside and out perfectly well today. I was the one who actually built it from scratch. He thought he could steal my entire life work easily. He planned to leave me drowning in his orchestrated debt, but karma never misses an address when seeking pure justice. The greedy always suffer the most tragic and devastating endings. Their downfall is always brought about by their own hands. I was no longer the submissive shadow hiding in corners. I was a certified public accountant with a burning vengeance. I was going to let him believe he had won. I would continue to serve him dinner with a smile. I would play his cruel game better than he could. I would smile and nod quietly while preparing the trap. When the shower finally stopped running, I took a breath. I arranged my features into a mask of pure innocence. Derek walked into the bedroom wrapped in a white towel. He smelled of fresh soap and absolutely suffocating male arrogance. "Good morning, darling," he said with an entirely fake smile. "Did you sleep well, my sweet, incredibly supportive, beautiful wife?" My fingers hovered over the smooth glass screen of the tablet. The sickening romantic messages with Vanessa had already shattered my heart into a million jagged pieces. But the sheer volume of data stored on this discarded device suggested a much darker reality. I closed the messaging application and opened the primary file manager. My background as a senior financial analyst immediately kicked in. I knew exactly how greedy corporate executives hid their dirty secrets. They never hid them in plain sight. I navigated through a complex maze of deeply nested folders, labeled with incredibly mundane project names. Finally, I found a locked directory titled Internal Audits. The passcode prompt appeared on the bright screen. I typed in the exact same 4 digits he used to unlock the tablet. Derek was unbelievably arrogant and completely careless. The folder opened instantly without a single warning. What I found inside made the agonizing pain of his physical infidelity compound into absolute pure horror. There were dozens of complex spreadsheets and encrypted legal documents perfectly organized by financial quarter. I opened the master financial ledger for the current fiscal year. My eyes scanned the familiar rows and columns of financial data. A freezing chill violently seized my spine. I was looking at 2 completely different sets of financial records. One set was the polished, pristine version Derek presented to his elite investors and the board of directors. It showed explosive revenue growth and massive profit margins. The other set was the brutal, undeniable truth. The real balance sheets were a catastrophic mess of massive debt and bleeding capital. But this disaster was not due to poor business performance or a shifting market. The company was actually generating massive legitimate revenue every single day. The capital was simply being drained away on purpose. I clicked on the master transaction history for the past 24 months. My breathing became dangerously shallow as I painstakingly traced the hidden flow of money. Derek had been systematically siphoning the core company capital week after week. This was the exact same capital built directly on my premarital savings. I had liquidated my entire robust stock portfolio and emptied my hard-earned retirement funds to buy the very first fleet of delivery trucks for his startup. I had worked grueling, unpaid 90-hour weeks from our cramped dining room table, balancing the corporate books and securing our first lucrative clients. I had skipped meals and lost sleep to ensure his dream survived its fragile first year. Every single dollar of profit we made was heavily soaked in my blood, sweat, and tears. And Derek was ruthlessly stealing it all. I followed the digital trail of outgoing wire transfers. He was aggressively funneling millions of dollars into 3 different offshore accounts. I recognized the routing numbers immediately from my days working at a top-tier financial firm. They were untraceable shell corporations registered deep in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. I opened the incorporation documents attached to the wire transfers. The primary beneficiary of these offshore accounts was a private holding company named after Vanessa. The sheer audacity of his theft made a wave of hot, sour bile rise rapidly in my throat. He was taking the vast wealth I had literally starved myself to build and handing it over to his pregnant mistress. He was generously funding their lavish future lifestyle with the direct fruits of my relentless and unseen labor. I opened another document labeled Liability Restructuring. My hand shook so violently I nearly dropped the heavy tablet onto the hardwood floor. It was a massive commercial loan agreement with a notoriously predatory private equity firm. Derek had borrowed heavily against the core company assets to acquire millions in liquid cash, but he had not signed the documents as the primary financial guarantor. I zoomed in on the signature line at the very bottom of the glowing screen. There, in perfect plain black ink, was my exact name. He had forged my signature flawlessly on the digital contracts. Or perhaps he had slipped this catastrophic document into a tall stack of routine vendor contracts he asked me to sign months ago when I still offered him my absolute blind trust. My chest physically ached as the full devastating reality of his scheme crashed down heavily on me. I was the sole legal guarantor for tens of millions of dollars in toxic corporate debt. The disparate pieces of his elaborate puzzle slammed together in my racing mind with terrifying clarity. It was never just about a secret affair or stealing company profits for a luxurious vacation. This was a highly calculated, premeditated plan to utterly destroy me. Derek was deliberately driving the logistics company straight into the ground while safely hiding the stolen cash overseas. He was desperately hunting Victor Thorne for that massive $50 million venture capital investment. Derek did not want that money to save the failing business. He wanted the venture capital funds as his final massive payday. I opened a drafted email saved securely in his outbox. It was addressed directly to his shady offshore wealth manager. The text of the email laid out his entire malicious endgame in plain English. Derek instructed the offshore banker to prepare for an incoming wire transfer of $50 million by the very end of the current month. He stated clearly that once the venture capital funds cleared the primary domestic accounts, He would execute an immediate transfer to the offshore shell companies. The very next day, he planned to officially file for corporate bankruptcy, claiming massive unexpected market losses. I stared blindly at the glowing screen as the oxygen left the room entirely. If Derek successfully secured the investment from Victor Thorne, he would drain the accounts instantly and vanish without a single trace. The entire logistics company would collapse into absolute ruin overnight. The federal investigators and furious creditors would demand their stolen money back immediately. And because my name was explicitly listed as the primary financial guarantor on all the toxic loans, I would be the one left holding the empty bag. I would be buried permanently under tens of millions of dollars in fraudulent debt. The authorities would look at my professional background as a certified financial analyst and naturally conclude I was the brilliant mastermind behind the complex embezzlement scheme. I would be facing a decade in a cold federal prison. Meanwhile, Derek would be sipping expensive champagne on a sunny private balcony in Paris with Vanessa and their new baby. He was going to completely sacrifice my freedom and my entire life just so he could escape. The sheer, monstrous scale of his betrayal paralyzed me where I sat. He was not just a cheating husband having a cliché office romance. He was a ruthless predator perfectly willing to throw his loyal wife to the wolves to save his own skin. The public auction at the charity gala last night was not just a drunken, cruel joke to impress his wealthy peers. It was a deliberate, calculated move to publicly humiliate me and establish a firm narrative that I was a useless, ignorant housewife. He was actively building a solid legal alibi. When the company collapsed and the massive fraud was finally discovered, he would simply play the helpless victim. He would tell the authorities that his manipulative, financially savvy wife had ruined his business and stolen all the funds while he was distracted. I sat completely alone in the dim bedroom, while the rhythmic sound of the shower running echoed loudly from the master bathroom. My husband was washing his body completely unaware that I was currently holding the absolute blueprint of his criminal conspiracy in my trembling hands. The terrified, heartbroken woman who had sobbed over cruel text messages just moments ago was entirely dead. The agonizing pain radiating through my broken heart was rapidly consumed by a freezing, absolute terror. But that terror did not break my spirit. It forged my soul into solid, unbreakable iron. My mind raced wildly with numbers, legal statutes, and corporate compliance laws. I was a top-tier financial professional. I knew exactly how to track stolen assets. I knew exactly how to trace hidden liabilities. I knew exactly how federal wire fraud cases were prosecuted in this country. Derek had underestimated me in the most fatal way possible. He looked at me and only saw a naive, submissive shadow he could easily manipulate and discard at his convenience. He completely forgot that I was the brilliant analytical mind who built his complex accounting infrastructure from absolutely nothing. He forgot that I knew the exact anatomy of a hostile financial audit. I quickly began downloading every single falsified balance sheet, every offshore wire confirmation, and every drafted email. I sent the entire cache of files directly to a secure encrypted cloud server I had set up years ago for my own personal backups. I made absolutely sure the digital transmission was completely untraceable. I watched the green progress bar slowly fill across the bright screen. Every single percentage point gained was another piece of heavy ammunition I would use to absolutely destroy him. I gathered the undeniable evidence of his massive theft, his forged signatures, and his premeditated plan to defraud Victor Thorne. Victor Thorne was a notoriously ruthless billionaire who destroyed absolutely anyone who ever crossed him. If Victor knew Derek was planning to steal his $50 million, Victor would absolutely obliterate my husband. And I was going to gladly hand Victor the matches to burn Derek to the ground. I was going to systematically dismantle my husband's life piece by painful piece. The covert download finally completed with a soft digital chime. I closed all the applications on the tablet and meticulously cleared the background cache. I carefully locked the silver device and placed it exactly where I had found it on the dark mahogany nightstand. I stood up and smoothed the wrinkles from my clothing. My breathing was perfectly calm now. My heart beat with a steady, lethal rhythm. The shock and profound sorrow were completely gone, replaced entirely by a cold, calculating, and steely demeanor. I would smile for him today. I would flawlessly play the part of the foolish, devoted wife. I would let him firmly believe his grand plan was working flawlessly. But karma never misses an address. The greedy and the betrayers will always suffer the most tragic endings. And I was going to personally deliver his absolute and utter ruin. I slid down the bedroom wall until my knees hit the cold hardwood floor. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal crashed over me like a suffocating tidal wave. I pressed my hands hard against my mouth to muffle the violent sobs tearing their way up my throat. Scalding tears streamed down my face, soaking my fingers and my silk robe. My entire world was actively shattering into a million jagged, unrecognizable pieces right in front of my eyes. 5 years of grueling sacrifices were completely obliterated by a few digital messages and a forged signature. The agonizing pain radiating through my chest was intense and entirely physical. It felt as though a serrated hunting knife was being slowly twisted directly into my heart. I gasped for air, feeling completely hollowed out and discarded. From the master bathroom just a few feet away, the rhythmic sound of the running shower continued to echo. Derek was casually humming a cheerful tune in the shower, entirely oblivious to the fact that my soul was bleeding out on the floor. He truly believed he had won. He truly believed he had successfully orchestrated my total financial and personal ruin. I sat in the dim light, allowing the devastating sorrow to wash over me for exactly 2 more minutes. And then something deep inside my chest simply snapped. The suffocating despair was incredibly fleeting. It evaporated like mist under a blazing hot sun. I slowly lowered my hands from my face. I wiped away the tears staining my cheeks. The shattered, heartbroken woman died quietly in that exact moment. I pushed myself up from the cold hardwood and walked silently over to the full-length mirror on the closet door. I stared directly into my own bloodshot eyes. The naive, submissive wife staring back at me was gone forever. In her place, a cold, calculating, and steely demeanor rapidly took root. The agonizing heartbreak was instantly replaced by a freezing, absolute fury. My gaze hardened, becoming as sharp as a knife. A surge of terrifying power radiated through my body. I was a top-tier financial professional. I built a massive corporate empire from a cramped dining room table. I was not going to let a deceitful, cheating narcissist and his flashy public relations mistress steal my entire life. There would be absolutely no loud, meaningless, jealous scenes today. I would not burst into that steamy bathroom screaming hysterically and demanding pathetic answers. Confronting a manipulator with tears and rage only feeds their massive ego. It only gives them the exact opportunity they need to gaslight you, hide their tracks, and twist the narrative to make you look insane. I refused to play the cliché role of the hysterical, discarded wife. I knew that screaming at him would completely ruin my ultimate advantage. The element of pure invisible surprise was my greatest weapon now. I was going to use my sharp intellect to completely dismantle his entire life. I was going to systematically strip away his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom. He would never see it coming until the federal handcuffs were already locked tightly around his arrogant wrists. I turned away from the mirror, moving with the silent, terrifying grace of an apex predator. I walked back over to the dark mahogany nightstand where his silver tablet rested. I pulled my own smartphone from the pocket of my robe and unlocked the screen. I opened the camera application, making absolutely sure the flash and the shutter sound were completely turned off. With methodical, clinical precision, I began to meticulously photograph every single piece of evidence on that glowing screen. I took high-resolution pictures of the horrifying text messages with Vanessa. I documented the exact timeline of their disgusting 2-year affair. I captured the sickening images of the positive pregnancy test and the designer infant shoes. I meticulously photographed the digital trails of the offshore bank transfers, the hidden corporate ledgers, and the forged commercial loan documents bearing my stolen signature. Every single digit captured was another fatal strike against him. I made absolutely sure every date, every timestamp, and every routing number was perfectly legible in my photographs. My hands were no longer shaking. They were perfectly steady, anchored by a deep, burning vengeance. I worked quickly and silently, capturing dozens of images that documented his massive corporate fraud and his vile personal infidelity. I backed up the photos instantly to a secure encrypted cloud server that he did not even know existed. Once I had successfully photographed every single damning detail, I closed the messaging application completely. I wiped the smooth glass screen clean of any lingering fingerprints using the soft edge of my silk robe. I carefully placed the tablet back onto the nightstand, positioning it at the exact same angle I had found it. I adjusted the device by a fraction of an inch to mirror his sloppy habits perfectly. I made sure the charging cable was draped flawlessly over the edge of the wood, just as he had left it. The trap was now fully armed and entirely invisible to him. I took one final deep breath, filling my lungs with a newfound sense of absolute lethal purpose. I was ready to face him. I was ready to smile warmly and serve him his morning coffee. I would look directly into his deceitful eyes and play the part of the devoted, supportive partner while secretly engineering his absolute destruction. He wanted to leave me holding the legal liability while he fled the country with his mistress and my money. He wanted to laugh at me while I drowned in his toxic debt. But karma never misses an address. The greedy and the betrayers always suffer the most tragic endings brought about by their own hands. I smoothed the lapels of my robe and practiced my soft, innocent smile in the mirror one last time. I listened as the shower water finally stopped running. I walked out of the bedroom ready to begin the ultimate game of chess. The crisp morning air hit my face like a necessary shock to my system as I quietly pulled the heavy front door of the mansion shut. The lock clicked into place with a definitive metallic thud, sealing my deceitful husband inside his comfortable illusion of total control. Derek was still upstairs, leisurely getting dressed for his morning meetings, completely oblivious to the fact that the obedient wife he left downstairs was actually walking away to forge the weapons of his absolute destruction. I walked across the paved driveway with perfectly measured steps. The gravel crunched softly beneath the soles of my sensible leather flats. I climbed into the driver's seat of my modest sedan and gripped the steering wheel firmly. My hands were no longer shaking. The paralyzing terror that had gripped my chest last night was entirely gone. It was completely replaced by a freezing, calculating determination that ran through my veins like ice water. I started the engine and drove away from the sprawling suburban prison. The city skyline loomed in the distance, representing the ultimate battlefield where this war would be fought and won. I navigated the bustling morning traffic of Manhattan with a singular lethal focus. My destination was not a casual coffee shop or a public park. I was heading to a highly secure, impenetrable location. I pulled into the underground parking garage of a towering glass and steel high-rise located deep in the financial district. This building housed one of the most elite and ruthless corporate law firms in the entire country. I rode the private elevator up to the 42nd floor. The polished stainless steel doors slid open silently, revealing a sleek, minimalist reception area. I bypassed the front desk entirely and walked straight down the long, silent corridor toward the corner office. The heavy frosted glass door bore a simple silver nameplate. It read Maya Thompson, Senior Partner. I pushed the door open and stepped into the expansive soundproof room. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding, unobstructed view of the sprawling city below. Sitting behind a sprawling slab of polished black marble was my sister-in-law, Maya. Maya was an absolutely formidable African-American woman who commanded respect the second she walked into any room. She wore a flawlessly tailored emerald green power suit that highlighted her sharp posture and unapologetic confidence. Her dark hair was styled in an immaculate sleek bob, and her piercing brown eyes missed absolutely nothing. Maya was Derek's older sister, but they were practically born from two completely different universes. While Derek was a charismatic manipulator who coasted on charm and stolen labor, Maya was a brilliant, relentless force of nature who had fought tooth and nail for every single ounce of her massive success. She had always seen right through her brother's arrogant facade. More importantly, Maya had always seen my true worth, even when Derek tried his hardest to constantly diminish me. She knew exactly how much blood and sweat I had poured into his logistics startup, while he took all the unearned glory. Maya looked up from her computer screen as I closed the heavy glass door behind me. She did not offer a warm family greeting or a casual pleasantry. She immediately noticed the cold, unnatural rigidity in my posture. She read the absolute devastation and the newly forged iron resolve hardening my features. She closed her laptop with a sharp snap and leaned forward, resting her elbows on the cool marble desk. "You finally saw it," Maya stated evenly. Her deep, resonant voice filled the quiet room, carrying a profound mixture of sadness and fierce validation. It was not a question. It was an absolute confirmation. She had been waiting patiently for the day the blindfold would finally fall from my eyes. I walked over to the heavy leather guest chair and sat down directly across from her. I reached into my leather handbag and retrieved the cold metal flash drive Victor Thorne had handed me last night. I placed it gently onto the black marble surface. I then reached back into my bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope containing the high-resolution color prints of every single digital screenshot I had captured from Derek's abandoned tablet. I slid the heavy envelope across the smooth desk until it rested right next to the silver drive. I found the real balance sheets, I said quietly. My voice was completely steady and devoid of any lingering affection. I found the hidden offshore routing numbers. I found the completely forged commercial loan agreements, where he maliciously signed my name as the sole financial guarantor. And I found the text messages with Vanessa. They are having a baby, Maya. They are planning to secure Victor Thorne's $50 million investment file, a fraudulent corporate bankruptcy, and flee the country together while leaving me to rot in federal prison for his massive tax fraud. Maya did not gasp or express loud, meaningless shock. She reached out with perfectly manicured fingers and slowly opened the thick manila envelope. The silence in the soundproof office was deafening as she methodically pulled out the stack of printed evidence. I sat perfectly still and watched her sharp eyes scan the vile text messages and the catastrophic financial documents. She read every single word describing her brother's devastating betrayal. She analyzed the sickening photos of the pregnancy test and the designer infant shoes. She reviewed the complex offshore wire transfers funded directly by my stolen savings. The temperature in the large corner office seemed to drop 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. Maya's face transformed into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The muscles in her jaw clenched tightly. Her dark eyes flared with a lethal protective anger. Derek always was a greedy, pathetic parasite, Maya finally said. Her voice was dangerously low and vibrating with raw power. But this level of calculated malicious fraud goes far beyond his usual arrogant stupidity. He actually believes he is smart enough to outwit federal regulators and completely destroy your life for his own selfish gain. She threw the stack of papers back onto the desk with a sharp, disgusted flick of her wrist. She looked directly at me. Her expression was fiercely validating and unapologetically aggressive. You built his entire kingdom from nothing, Ava. You gave him the very foundation he stands on. He thinks you are just a naive little workhorse who will quietly take the fall. He fundamentally misunderstands the absolute hellfire he just invited into his life. We are not going to let him get away with this, I replied, my tone matching her cold intensity perfectly. I am not going to shed another meaningless tear for a man who views me as entirely disposable. I want to completely dismantle his life, Maya. I want to systematically strip away his stolen wealth, his fake reputation, and his precious freedom. I want him to lose absolutely everything he values before he can even pack a single bag for Paris. But I need your help to execute this perfectly. I need your brilliant legal mind to trap him in his own deeply woven web. Maya leaned back in her high-backed leather chair and steepled her fingers thoughtfully. A slow, predatory smile began to form on her lips. She was no longer looking at me as just a sister-in-law. She was looking at me as a formidable partner in a massive high-stakes corporate war. We are going to execute a completely silent and flawless counterattack, Maya declared smoothly. We are going to build an invisible cage around him, so perfectly constructed that he will not feel the steel bars until they are already locked tightly around his throat. First, we have to immediately address the forged loan documents. We are going to quietly file a sealed injunction with the federal banking authorities to officially dispute your signature as the primary guarantor. We will provide these explicit text messages as concrete proof of his malicious intent to commit massive wire fraud. This will instantly freeze his ability to move any more domestic capital without triggering massive internal compliance alarms. I nodded, absorbing her brilliant strategy. The panic I had felt last night regarding the massive debt was completely neutralized by her swift legal action. If we freeze the domestic accounts, what happens when the $50 million venture capital investment from Victor Thorne actually clears? I asked. Derek is relying entirely on that massive influx of cash to fund his escape with Vanessa. He plans to wire it offshore the second it hits the primary corporate ledger. Maya picked up the silver flash drive Victor had given me and twirled it between her fingers. That is exactly where the absolute beauty of our plan comes into play, she explained. We are going to let him successfully secure the massive investment. We are going to let him feel the absolute arrogant thrill of ultimate victory. But I am going to completely reroute the internal beneficiary pathways of the offshore holding companies he established for Vanessa. We will legally quietly transfer the sole ownership of those specific shell corporations directly back to you as restitution for the premarital assets he unlawfully siphoned. When Derek eagerly attempts to execute the massive wire transfer, he will unwittingly deposit the entire $50 million straight into an impenetrable legal trust controlled entirely by you. A genuine dark thrill coursed through my veins. The sheer poetic justice of his impending ruin was incredibly intoxicating. He would effectively rob himself. He would steal the venture capital funds only to lock them away in an account he could never access again. And what about the fraudulent corporate bankruptcy he plans to file? I asked, pressing further into the logistics of our trap. He plans to claim catastrophic market losses to completely wash away the millions he already stole. We will let him officially file the bankruptcy paperwork. Maya answered, her dark eyes gleaming with pure, ruthless intelligence. Filing false bankruptcy claims to intentionally obscure stolen assets is a massive federal crime. The second he submits those falsified balance sheets to the commercial court, we will simultaneously deliver this entire cache of true unedited financial ledgers to the district attorney. We will provide them with his drafted emails explicitly detailing his premeditated fraud scheme. We will hand them the precise digital trail proving he intentionally drove the company into the ground while hoarding the stolen profits. He will effectively hand the federal prosecutors the exact loaded gun they need to put him away for a decade. The meticulous plan was absolutely beautiful in its pure destructive simplicity. We were going to let Derek build his own beautiful coffin and happily nail himself inside. I looked at Maya feeling a profound sense of gratitude and unbreakable solidarity. Two women sitting in a silent glass office preparing to completely obliterate a toxic narcissistic man who thought he could simply use us and throw us away. I reached across the cold black marble desk and grasped Maya's hands firmly. We do this flawlessly, I whispered, my voice carrying the heavy weight of a final absolute promise. We do not make a single sound. We let him smile and boast and celebrate his fake victory. We let him think I am still the blind, obedient wife. And when the perfect moment arrives, we burn his entire pathetic kingdom straight to the very ground. Maya squeezed my hands back with incredible strength. Her predatory smile widened, radiating absolute boss energy. Karma is a remarkably patient hunter, Ava. And today, we are personally loading the rifle. The absolute ruin of Derek begins right now. We spent the next 3 hours in that secure, soundproof room, mapping out every single legal maneuver. We drafted the covert injunctions and prepared the sealed financial disputes. We built a watertight, invisible prison for a man who truly believed he had already won the entire game. I finally left her office feeling lighter and far more dangerous than ever before. I was ready to go back to my sprawling suburban prison. I was ready to look my cheating, manipulative husband in his arrogant eyes and smile, knowing that his complete and total devastation was already mathematically guaranteed. The heavy oak doors of the private dining club in Manhattan closed behind me with a muted, solid thud. I had carefully selected this ultra-exclusive location for our covert meeting tonight. It was a place where powerful billionaires conducted their ruthless business in absolute silence, far away from the prying eyes of desperate, pathetic men like my husband. The dimly lit mahogany-paneled room smelled faintly of expensive cigars and aged leather. I wore a perfectly tailored black suit that matched the freezing iron resolve pumping rapidly through my veins. My hands did not shake as I clutched my leather briefcase tightly against my side. I walked across the plush oriental rug toward the highly secluded corner booth. Victor Thorne was already waiting for me. He sat perfectly still in the deep shadows, radiating that exact same terrifying predatory aura he possessed at the charity gala. He wore a flawless midnight blue bespoke suit, and his dark, sharp eyes locked onto me the very second I entered his line of sight. He did not offer a polite smile or a meaningless social greeting. I slid into the cold leather booth directly across from him. The heavy silence between us was thick and deeply electric. It was the profound silence of two apex predators quietly evaluating each other before a massive hunt. I took a deep, steadying breath and opened my briefcase. I pulled out a thick, perfectly organized dossier containing the true unedited financial ledgers of Derek's logistics company. I placed the heavy stack of documents right onto the polished mahogany table and slid it firmly toward him. I did not bring you apologies or pathetic excuses, I stated clearly, keeping my voice incredibly low and remarkably steady. I brought you the absolute, undeniable truth about my husband's corporation. Victor did not say a single word in response. He reached out with his large, warm hands and slowly opened the thick dossier. For the next 20 minutes, the only sound in the secluded booth was the crisp turning of paper. I watched his sharp, piercing eyes scan the complex spreadsheets, the falsified profit margins, and the damning offshore wire transfer records. He was a ruthless titan of venture capital who successfully dismantled failing corporations for breakfast. I knew he would instantly recognize the catastrophic financial bleeding hidden deep within those pages. I broke the heavy silence and began to verbally guide him through the massive labyrinth of corporate fraud. I explained exactly how Derek had been systematically siphoning the core company capital week after week. I pointed out the precise routing numbers of the untraceable shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands. I detailed the incredibly toxic commercial loan agreements where Derek had maliciously forged my signature to secure millions in liquid cash. I spoke with absolute clinical precision. I did not shed a single tear or let my voice waver even slightly. I utilized every ounce of my professional expertise as a senior financial auditor to completely expose the rotting foundation of the startup I had personally built from absolutely nothing. I showed him exactly how Derek planned to secure his massive $50 million investment, then execute a fraudulent bankruptcy, and finally flee the country with his pregnant mistress, while leaving me completely buried in massive federal debt. I fully expected Victor to slam the file shut in absolute disgust. I expected him to instantly withdraw his lucrative funding offer and unleash his legendary wrath upon my cheating husband. But Victor did not react with blind fury. He slowly closed the dossier and rested his large hands flat on the polished table. He looked up at me and his dark eyes were gleaming with an intense, profound fascination. The terrifyingly cold titan of finance was actually smiling. It was a slow, dangerous, and incredibly appreciative smile. He leaned forward, invading my personal space slightly, and studied my face with intense calculation. "Your husband is an arrogant fool playing an incredibly dangerous game," Victor murmured, his voice vibrating with lethal amusement. "But you, Ava, are an absolute revelation. You did not just uncover this massive scheme. You completely reverse-engineered his entire criminal network in less than 24 hours. You tracked complex offshore accounts that most federal regulators would miss entirely." I looked right back at him, refusing to shrink under his heavy, intimidating gaze. "I built the entire financial infrastructure of that company from a cramped dining room table," I replied coldly. "I know every single hidden trapdoor because I designed the foundational architecture. Derek is simply stealing the keys to a house he never actually knew how to build." Victor nodded slowly, absorbing my absolute defiance. He saw right through the polite, submissive wife routine I had been forced to play for years. He saw the brilliant strategic mind I had hidden away to protect a weak man's fragile ego. "You came here tonight fully expecting me to destroy him," Victor stated smoothly. "You handed me the exact weapon to obliterate his miserable life. But I have a much more entertaining proposition for you, Ava." Victor reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black pen. He tapped it rhythmically against the wooden table. "If I simply withdraw my funding offer, Derek will panic and run immediately," Victor explained with chilling logic. "He will flee with whatever stolen cash he has already secured, and you will spend years fighting his forged documents in federal court. That is incredibly messy and deeply unsatisfying. We are not going to do that. Instead, we are going to give your arrogant husband exactly what he desperately wants." My heart pounded a rapid, fierce rhythm against my ribs as I listened to his words. "We are going to fully approve the $50 million venture capital investment," Victor continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. We will let him sign the finalized contracts and celebrate his fake victory. But we will secretly structure the investment capital as a highly aggressive convertible debt instrument. The moment he attempts to unlawfully wire those massive funds offshore to his mistress, he will instantly violate the strict financial covenants of my contract. That specific legal violation will immediately trigger a hostile corporate takeover. I will seize total, absolute control of his entire logistics company in a matter of seconds. I will legally strip him of his shares, his executive title, and every single dime he thinks he stole. I stared at Victor as the absolute brilliance of his incredibly ruthless plan washed over me. He was not just going to punish Derek. He was going to completely annihilate him financially and legally. He was going to trap my husband in a perfectly constructed invisible cage. And what exactly is my role in this hostile takeover, I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level despite the adrenaline rushing through my veins. You are going to be my silent partner, Victor declared, his dark eyes locking onto mine with fierce intensity. You are going to go back home and play the devoted, loving wife perfectly. You will smile and nod and convince him that I am completely sold on his brilliant pitch. You will ensure he signs the final closing documents without suspecting a single thing. And when the trap finally snaps shut and his entire world comes crashing down around him, you will be standing right beside me to watch him burn. A profound freezing chill ran rapidly down my stiff spine. This was a highly dangerous game with astronomical stakes. If Derek suspected anything, he would vanish instantly. But looking into Victor's incredibly sharp, calculating eyes, I felt a surge of terrifying, unadulterated power. I had spent 5 entire years making myself painfully small so my deceitful husband could feel comfortably big. I had sacrificed my incredible career, my brilliant mind, and my unwavering loyalty for a pathetic man who viewed me as entirely disposable. I was completely done being the underestimated shadow in the background. I reached across the dark mahogany table and picked up the sleek black pen Victor had set down. I held it firmly in my hand, feeling the heavy weight of my monumental decision. The heartbroken, naive girl who wept on the bathroom floor was officially dead and buried. I was stepping fully into my absolute power. I was transforming into a strategic powerhouse who would rewrite the entire ending of this miserable story. I accept your proposition, Victor, I said, my voice radiating absolute steely authority. We will give him exactly what he wants, and then we will legally strip him of absolutely everything he has ever loved. Victor smiled again, a genuinely predatory grin that promised absolute devastation for my cheating husband. The partnership was officially forged in the quiet shadows of the exclusive club. We sat together in the dim light, meticulously mapping out every single detail of the flawless counterattack. I felt a cold, brilliant fire igniting deep within my soul. Derek thought he had orchestrated the perfect escape plan. He completely forgot that karma never misses an address. The greedy and the betrayers always suffer the most tragic endings brought about by their own hands. He was about to walk blindly into a devastating inferno, and I was going to gladly hold the matches. I listened carefully as Victor outlined the complex legal mechanisms we would employ to freeze the hidden offshore accounts simultaneously. He was incredibly thorough, leaving absolutely no room for error. We spent another hour drafting the exact timeline of the impending hostile takeover. I provided him with all the necessary internal access codes and the hidden backdoor server pathways I had secretly programmed years ago. We were building an inescapable corporate fortress right underneath Derek's arrogant nose. I left the private club later that night feeling lighter and far more dangerous than I ever had before. I was ready to return to my sprawling suburban prison and look my deceitful husband directly in the eyes. I was finally ready to play the ultimate game of high-stakes chess and secure my absolute victory. The drive back to our sprawling suburban estate felt entirely different tonight. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my modest sedan, feeling a completely new and intoxicating energy rushing through my veins. The terrified, humiliated woman who had wept on the cold bathroom floor just 24 hours ago was officially dead. In her place sat a perfectly calibrated weapon of absolute destruction. I parked in the long sweeping driveway and took one final deep breath of the crisp night air. I looked up at the massive dark windows of the house I had painstakingly turned into a home. It was no longer my sanctuary. It was now the primary battlefield, where I would execute the final stages of his complete financial and personal ruin. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored black suit and walked through the heavy front doors. The house was completely silent. Derek was still at the office, desperately trying to finalize the fake corporate ledgers for his upcoming meetings. This gave me the exact window of opportunity I needed. I walked swiftly into the kitchen and retrieved a small, innocuous shopping bag I had carefully hidden in the back of my car trunk earlier that afternoon. Inside the bag were 4 state-of-the-art hidden surveillance cameras. They were incredibly small, completely wireless, and disguised as ordinary household objects. I had purchased them using cash at a specialty electronics store deep in the city, ensuring there was absolutely no digital paper trail linking them back to me. My hands were perfectly steady as I carried the equipment into his opulent home office. The room reeked of his arrogant vanity. It was filled with dark leather heavy mahogany furniture and framed awards he had essentially stolen from my hard work. I moved with the silent grace of an apex predator. I took the first tiny camera, which was cleverly embedded inside a sleek digital clock, and placed it directly on his expansive desk. I angled it perfectly to capture his entire seating area and his computer monitor. The second camera was disguised as a standard USB phone charger. I plugged it directly into the wall outlet right next to his leather reading chair, where he always sat to make his private evening phone calls. I stepped back and evaluated my flawless work. The lenses were completely invisible to the naked eye. I quickly synced the devices to a secure encrypted application on my personal smartphone. The high-definition video feeds immediately popped up on my screen, capturing every single inch of his private sanctuary. A cold, deeply satisfying smile curved my lips. I then moved silently into the main living room. I knew exactly where Derek liked to pace and boast when he was feeling particularly victorious. I placed the third camera disguised as a simple air purifier on the mantel, directly across from his favorite velvet armchair. I positioned the final camera inside a decorative artificial plant near the expensive liquor cabinet. Derek could never resist pouring himself a massive glass of premium scotch while bragging about his brilliant corporate maneuvers. Now every single vile word he spoke, every malicious plan he hatched, and every arrogant confession he made would be recorded in pristine high-definition audio and video. The invisible cage Maya and I had designed was now fully armed and completely operational. I retreated to the kitchen and quickly changed out of my power suit. I slipped into a soft pastel floral dress and tied my hair back into a messy, effortless bun. I was meticulously stripping away the strategic powerhouse and putting the naive, submissive wife costume firmly back on. I began preparing his absolute favorite meal. I chopped fresh vegetables and seared an expensive cut of steak, humming a cheerful little melody as the savory aroma filled the large house. The stark contrast between my domestic actions and my lethal internal focus was almost entirely surreal. I was cooking a beautiful dinner for the very monster who planned to leave me rotting in a federal prison. I felt absolutely no guilt. I felt no lingering affection. I only felt the freezing cold anticipation of a hunter waiting patiently in the blind. Exactly an hour later, I heard the heavy front door swing open. The heavy thud of his expensive leather shoes echoed in the grand foyer. "Ava, darling, I am home," Derek called out, his voice dripping with that smooth, charismatic charm he used to manipulate everyone around him. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel and walked out to greet him. I forced my facial muscles to relax completely, lifting the corners of my mouth into a warm, glowing, and entirely fake smile. "Welcome home, sweetheart," I murmured, stepping forward to take his heavy leather briefcase. "How was your incredibly busy day at the office?" Derek sighed dramatically and rolled his shoulders, rolling his neck as if he carried the weight of the entire world. He leaned down and pressed a careless kiss to my cheek. He smelled strongly of the city street stale coffee and the lingering, sickeningly sweet floral perfume that Vanessa always wore. I forced myself not to flinch. I accepted the kiss with a soft, practiced sigh of devotion. It was an absolute nightmare. He complained loudly, loosening his silk tie and marching straight toward the living room liquor cabinet. "The investors are breathing down my neck, and the legal compliance team is driving me completely insane. I swear I am surrounded by total idiots who do not understand my grand vision." I followed him into the living room, keeping my posture entirely submissive and attentive. I watched as he poured himself 3 fingers of his most expensive scotch standing directly in the center of the hidden camera frame. I pulled my phone from my pocket under the guise of checking a text message and quickly verified that the recording application was capturing everything perfectly. The red recording dot blinked steadily on my screen. "That sounds so stressful, darling," I said softly, walking over and gently resting my hand on his arm. "Is the massive deal with Mr. Thorne causing you trouble? I called his office this morning just like you asked me to. I really hope I helped smooth things over for you." Derek took a massive swallow of his drink and laughed a harsh, arrogant sound that echoed in the large room. "Oh, you definitely helped Ava. Thorne is officially reviewing the finalized contracts tomorrow morning. But the sheer amount of useless legal hurdles my own lawyers are making me jump through is absolutely pathetic. They are terrified of the federal commerce regulations. They keep whining about offshore capital gains and mandatory domestic asset retention." I widened my eyes perfectly, mimicking a confused and deeply concerned housewife. "Offshore capital?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "I thought all the company funds were strictly kept in the primary domestic accounts to fund the new logistics fleet." "Why are your lawyers worried about offshore regulations, Derek?" Derek scoffed and threw himself into his velvet armchair, landing squarely in the center of the second hidden camera frame. "Because my lawyers are spineless cowards," he declared, waving his glass carelessly in the air. "They do not understand how real wealth is generated and protected. You cannot just leave $50 million sitting in a heavily taxed domestic account, Ava. That is incredibly stupid. I have already established 3 highly secure private holding companies in the Cayman Islands. As soon as Thorne's venture capital clears the primary ledger, I am legally routing every single dime through a completely untraceable shell corporation." My heart leaped with absolute cold triumph, but I kept my face entirely blank. He was literally confessing to premeditated massive wire fraud and international money laundering directly on camera. I needed him to keep talking. I needed him to dig the hole so deep he could never possibly climb out. "But is that not incredibly dangerous?" I murmured, wringing my hands together to feign nervous anxiety. "What if the federal auditors trace the massive transfer? What if they look at the corporate loan guarantors and demand the money back immediately?" Derek threw his head back and laughed, genuinely amused by my pathetic ignorance. "Let them look." He mocked, his voice dripping with supreme malicious arrogance. "Let them audit the entire damn building. By the time those slow, pathetic government bureaucrats realize the capital is gone, I will have officially filed a Chapter 11 corporate bankruptcy claiming catastrophic sudden market failures. The funds will be completely washed through the Caribbean accounts and utterly untouchable. And as for the commercial loan guarantors, well, that is the absolute best part of my brilliant strategy." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, looking directly at me with a sickening predatory gleam in his bloodshot eyes. "The corporate loans are securely locked down. I made absolutely sure the liability falls exactly where it needs to fall. You do not need to worry your pretty little head about the federal auditors, Ava. I have completely insulated myself from the impending blast radius. The entire collapse is going to look like a tragic, unavoidable business failure, and I will walk away completely clean." He was practically glowing with the sheer thrill of his own perceived genius. He had absolutely no idea he had just handed a federal prosecutor a flawless ironclad video confession. He had explicitly detailed his plan to steal Victor Thorne's $50 million, hide it in illicit offshore accounts, file a fraudulent corporate bankruptcy, and leave his naive wife to take the devastating legal fall. The recording captured his face, his voice, and his undeniable malicious intent with crystal clear perfection. I stood there in my soft floral dress, looking down at the man who had promised to love and protect me. I felt a profound freezing wave of pure absolute power wash over my entire soul. I was holding his entire life, his freedom, and his stolen empire right in the palm of my hand. "You are so incredibly brilliant, Derek," I whispered softly, ensuring the hidden microphones picked up my sweet, submissive tone perfectly. "I honestly do not know how you manage to carry all this heavy burden completely by yourself. You always know exactly what to do to protect our future." Derek smiled a smug, satisfied grin and took another long sip of his scotch. "That is exactly why I am the Chief Executive Officer, Ava. Now be a good wife and bring me my dinner." I am completely starving and I have a very long night of finalizing these beautiful contracts ahead of me. Of course, darling, I replied obediently, turning around and walking slowly back toward the kitchen. The second my back was turned to him, the sweet, innocent smile instantly vanished from my face. My features settled back into a mask of freezing, calculating ice. I pulled my phone from my pocket and quickly stopped the hidden recording, saving the massive video file directly to the secure encrypted offshore server Maya had prepared for us. The evidence was officially locked away, entirely safe from his arrogant reach. I picked up his warm dinner plate and carried it back out to the living room, serving him with the graceful, silent poise of an executioner preparing the final lethal blow. The countdown to his absolute devastation had officially begun, and he was entirely oblivious to the ticking clock. The morning sun poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of our pristine kitchen, casting long, sharp shadows across the imported marble island. I stood perfectly still by the gleaming espresso machine, watching the dark, rich liquid drip slowly into Derek's favorite porcelain mug. My posture was the absolute picture of domestic tranquility. I wore a soft cashmere sweater and a modest pleated skirt, playing the role of the devoted, obedient wife flawlessly. But beneath that carefully constructed pastel facade, my blood ran freezing cold. Every single nerve ending in my body was completely electrified with lethal anticipation. I had spent the entire night wide awake, staring at the dark ceiling, going over every single detail of the magnificent trap Maya and I had meticulously built. Derek walked into the kitchen radiating a sickening wave of arrogant confidence. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and a silk tie that cost more than the average monthly mortgage. He smelled of expensive cologne and the lingering deceit of a man who firmly believed he was the smartest person in any room. "Good morning, beautiful," he crooned, slipping his arm around my waist and pressing a careless kiss to my cheek. I forced my muscles to relax completely, suppressing the violent urge to shove him away. "Good morning, darling," I replied, my voice dripping with sugary submission. I slid the steaming mug of black coffee across the marble counter toward him. "You look incredibly handsome today. Is everything ready for your big final meetings with Victor Thorne?" Derek took a long, arrogant sip of his coffee and smiled a greedy, predatory smile. "Everything is falling into place perfectly, Ava. Thorne is ready to sign the final venture capital agreements by the end of the week. But there is just one tiny administrative detail we need to handle this morning before I head into the city." He set his coffee mug down and casually reached into his sleek leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick blue legal folder and dropped it onto the counter right in front of me. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the marble echoed loudly in the quiet kitchen. I looked down at the folder, feeling a dark, thrilling wave of adrenaline rush through my veins. Maya had warned me this exact moment was coming. She knew his playbook inside and out. "What is this, Derek?" I asked, widening my eyes and tilting my head to perfectly mimic a confused and entirely ignorant housewife. "It is just a standard post-nuptial agreement," he said smoothly, waving his hand in the air, as if dismissing a trivial annoyance. "My lawyers insisted on it, Ava. With Victor Thorne injecting $50 million into the logistics company, the federal regulators are going to be scrutinizing every single corporate asset. This document is simply a formality to protect you from any potential personal liabilities. If the market suddenly shifts, or the company faces unexpected legal hurdles, I absolutely do not want your personal savings, or this beautiful house to be targeted by the greedy creditors." I stared at his handsome, lying face, absolutely disgusted by the sheer magnitude of his manipulation. He was actively trying to strip me of all my legal marital rights and every single penny I had ever earned. He was laying the final legal groundwork to abandon me with massive toxic debt, while he ran off to Paris with Vanessa and their new baby. He was dressing up his ultimate betrayal as a loving, protective gesture. The absolute audacity of his lies made my stomach churn violently, but I kept my soft, naive smile perfectly intact. "Oh, Derek, you always work so incredibly hard to protect our family," I whispered, keeping my tone entirely sweet and completely devoid of any suspicion. "But legal documents always make me so incredibly nervous. You know I do not understand all that complex corporate jargon." Derek chuckled, a low, condescending sound that grated painfully against my eardrums. "You do not need to understand it, darling. That is exactly why you have me. I have already read through every single line. It simply separates our financial profiles on paper, so the massive venture capital funds do not accidentally entangle your personal credit. Just sign the back page, and I will have my legal team file it quietly this afternoon. I slowly reached out and pulled the heavy blue folder toward me. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my hands remained incredibly steady. I opened the cover and pretended to scan the dense paragraphs of legal text. I knew exactly what those pages contained. I had spent hours studying the identical draft Maya had acquired through her covert corporate channels. The document was designed to entirely sever my equity in the startup I had personally built from scratch. This looked so incredibly complicated. I sighed softly, rubbing my forehead as if I were getting a headache from simply looking at the words. Derek. I need to grab my reading glasses from my home office upstairs. I cannot focus on this tiny print at all. And let me make you a fresh plate of scrambled eggs before you leave. You have a massive day ahead of you, and you need your strength. Derek checked his expensive watch and let out a dramatic, irritated sigh. Fine, Ava, but please be quick. I cannot be late for the executive briefing. I turned my back on him, leaving the blue folder sitting openly on the marble counter. I walked out of the kitchen with slow, measured steps, ensuring my demeanor remained entirely casual. The very second I crossed the threshold into the main hallway and was completely out of his line of sight, my entire posture shifted dramatically. The naive, hesitant wife vanished instantly. I sprinted silently up the carpeted stairs, moving with the terrifying speed and precision of a seasoned operative. I slipped into my private study and closed the heavy oak door without making a single sound. I rushed over to my locked filing cabinet and quickly punched in the security code. I pulled open the heavy metal drawer and retrieved an identical thick blue legal folder. Maya was an absolute genius of corporate warfare. When I told her Derek would likely try to force me into a post-nuptial agreement before his fraudulent bankruptcy, she immediately drafted a lethal counterattack. The document inside my hands looked completely identical to the one Derek had brought home. It had the exact same font, the exact same formatting, and the exact same heavy legal paper stock. But the clauses hidden deeply inside the dense paragraphs were vastly different. Instead of severing my marital assets, Maya's brilliant contract contained an incredibly aggressive poison pill. The document explicitly stated that in the event of any documented financial fraud, embezzlement, or gross corporate mismanagement perpetrated by my husband, total and absolute control of his voting shares would immediately transfer directly to me. It legally stripped him of his entire executive authority and granted me full unilateral power over all his domestic and offshore accounts. It was a flawless, invisible death warrant for his entire fraudulent empire. I clutched the lethal blue folder tightly against my chest, feeling a massive surge of pure, unadulterated power. I grabbed my reading glasses from the mahogany desk and silently slipped back out into the hallway. I descended the stairs, maintaining my calm, steady breathing. When I reached the bottom floor, I paused for a fraction of a second to compose my facial features perfectly. I walked back into the bright kitchen, sliding my reading glasses onto my face with a soft, helpless sigh. Derek was standing by the window, furiously typing a text message onto his phone. He was likely updating his pregnant mistress about how incredibly easy it was to fool his pathetic wife. He did not even look up as I re-entered the room. I walked directly over to the marble island where his original blue folder was still resting. I casually bumped my hip against the edge of the counter, deliberately knocking a stack of mail and a few decorative magazines onto the floor. Oh, I am so incredibly clumsy today. I gasped loudly, bending down instantly to pick up the scattered mess. Derek groaned in sheer annoyance, finally looking up from his phone. Ava, please just leave the mess for the housekeeper. We do not have time for this nonsense today. I am so sorry, darling. I just need one quick second. I babbled frantically, gathering the fallen papers. In one completely flawless fluid motion, I slid his original blue folder off the counter and directly into the stack of magazines in my hands. Simultaneously, I placed Maya's visually identical blue folder squarely onto the marble island exactly where his had been sitting. The sleight of hand was absolutely perfect. My years of meticulous auditing and handling complex paperwork translated into a seamless, invisible swap. I stood back up, clutching the magazines and his original contract tightly against my chest. I offered him a flustered, apologetic smile. "I am so sorry, Derek. I am just a little overwhelmed this morning." He rolled his eyes aggressively and tapped his fingers impatiently against the marble counter. "Just sign the damn paperwork, Ava. I need to get into the city." I set the magazines down carefully on a distant chair, keeping his original document safely hidden. I walked back over to the counter and looked down at Maya's lethal contract. I picked up the sleek silver pen resting next to his coffee mug. My hand hovered over the signature line on the very last page. I looked up at him, playing the hesitant, naive victim one last time. "Are you absolutely certain this is the right thing to do, Derek?" I asked, my voice wavering perfectly. "I just want our family to be safe. I trust you completely, but signing away my rights feels so incredibly final." Derek let out a harsh, cruel laugh. He stepped forward and placed his heavy hands firmly on my shoulders, looking down at me with supreme arrogant condescension. "Ava, you are being completely ridiculous. This is how the real corporate world works. You have to trust the experts. I am literally building a massive empire for our future. Do you really think I would ever do anything to jeopardize you? Just sign the paper and let me handle the heavy lifting. You are overthinking everything, just like you always do." I looked deeply into his deceitful, bloodshot eyes. He was so completely blinded by his own massive ego that he could not see the absolute inferno waiting directly beneath his feet. He honestly believed I was nothing more than a foolish stepping stone on his path to a fraudulent paradise. He had absolutely no idea he was standing in the very center of a perfectly constructed trap. "Okay, Derek," I whispered softly, keeping my gaze locked entirely onto his. "I trust you." I lowered my head and quickly scribbled my signature across the bottom of Maya's lethal contract. I pushed the heavy blue folder across the smooth marble counter toward him. I handed him the silver pen with a soft, compliant smile. "You need to countersign the bottom of the last page to make it legally binding," the lawyer said. Derek snatched the pen from my hand with a victorious smirk. He did not bother to flip back through the pages. He did not bother to scan the dense legal paragraphs to ensure the text had not been altered. He was so unbelievably arrogant, so entirely convinced of his own supreme intelligence, that he simply flipped to the final signature page. He did not read a single word of the incredibly dangerous fine print. He just saw my signature and completely assumed he had won the entire war. He pressed the silver pen to the heavy paper and boldly slashed his signature right next to mine. The sharp scratching sound of the ink tearing across the page echoed loudly in my ears. It was the absolute sweetest symphony I had ever heard in my entire life. It was the undeniable sound of a treacherous man legally signing away his entire existence. He closed the blue folder with a sharp, triumphant snap. He slid the lethal document securely into his expensive leather briefcase and clicked the heavy brass lock shut. There, he declared, his voice booming with arrogant satisfaction. "That was not so difficult now, was it? You did the right thing, Ava. You are a very good wife." He leaned forward and kissed my cheek one final time, before grabbing his briefcase and striding confidently out of the kitchen. I stood perfectly still by the marble island, listening to the heavy front door open and slam shut. I heard the powerful engine of his luxury car roar to life and gravel crunch as he sped down the long driveway, heading straight toward the city. The second his car completely vanished from the property, the soft, naive smile entirely evaporated from my face. My features hardened into a mask of freezing, unyielding ice. I looked down at the empty marble counter where the blue folder had just been sitting. My heart beat with a slow, deliberate, and completely lethal rhythm. The post-nuptial trap had snapped completely shut. Derek had just legally handed me the absolute keys to his entire kingdom. He was driving into the city fully believing he was about to steal $50 million and escape to Paris. He had no idea he was now completely at my mercy. I turned around and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, feeling a profound surging wave of pure absolute power. The total devastation of my husband was no longer just a plan. It was now a legally binding reality, and I was going to enjoy watching him burn. The following afternoon, Derek hosted a lavish corporate luncheon at an incredibly exclusive rooftop restaurant in downtown Manhattan. He claimed the expensive gathering was a necessary morale booster for the executive team ahead of the massive venture capital acquisition. In reality, it was simply another extravagant stage for him to parade his inflated ego and soak in the sycophantic praise of his completely blind subordinates. I attended the event standing dutifully by his side. I wore a deeply conservative beige dress that I purposely chose to make myself look as utterly unremarkable and domesticated as possible. I stood quietly near the open windows, holding a glass of sparkling water, and playing the flawless role of the supportive, incredibly naive wife. I nodded and smiled politely as his colleagues offered fake compliments, while stealing sideways glances at Vanessa. She was standing across the crowded room draped in a scandalously tight crimson dress that left absolutely nothing to the imagination. She was holding court with a group of junior executives and laughing a little too loudly at every single boring joke Derek made. The sheer audacity of their public performance was physically nauseating to witness, but I kept my facial features perfectly locked into a mask of placid ignorance. The heavy invisible armor I wore protected my rapidly calculating mind. I was no longer a helpless victim waiting for the inevitable slaughter. I was a meticulous financial auditor, actively gathering the final lethal pieces of evidence needed to destroy them both. The deafening noise of clinking crystal glasses and loud corporate boasting eventually gave me a pounding headache. I excused myself from the arrogant circle of executives and walked down the long-carpeted hallway toward the luxury ladies' restroom to find a brief moment of absolute silence. The restroom was a massive expanse of polished white marble and gleaming gold fixtures. It was completely empty when I walked in. I stepped inside the furthest corner stall and locked the heavy wooden door, simply leaning my back against the cool, solid surface to steady my breathing. I closed my eyes, visualizing the exact legal parameters Maya and I had constructed the night before. Suddenly, the heavy main door swung open with a loud, forceful bang. A wave of loud giggling shattered the quiet sanctuary. Along with the sharp clicking of expensive high heels, came an absolutely suffocating stench of cheap, overwhelmingly sweet floral perfume. It was the exact same nauseating scent that had clung to Derek's shirt collar for the past 2 entire years. I stopped breathing instantly and remained perfectly frozen in the dark shadow of the stall. It was Vanessa, accompanied by 2 of her loyal subordinates from the public relations department. I listened closely as they dropped their heavy designer handbags onto the marble counter and began touching up their makeup. Their voices echoed loudly against the tiled walls, completely stripped of their polite corporate filters. You have to admit, Vanessa, one of the junior girls, laughed sharply. You are playing a very dangerous game right in front of her face today. Vanessa scoffed a harsh, ugly sound that completely exposed her true toxic nature. Please, she is absolutely clueless, Vanessa mocked loudly, applying a fresh coat of bright red lipstick. Did you see that hideous beige dress she is wearing out there? She looks like a pathetic, exhausted librarian. Derek told me she literally spends her entire weekend reorganizing his sock drawer and baking stupid casseroles. She has absolutely zero ambition and zero fire. It is honestly embarrassing to even be in the same room with her. I cannot believe Derek lasted 5 whole years tied to that boring, miserable anchor. I stood completely motionless behind the wooden door. A few days ago, those cruel, vicious words would have brought me to my knees in agonizing emotional pain. Today, they meant absolutely nothing at all. They were just the meaningless buzzing of an insect trapped inside a glass jar. Vanessa continued her arrogant tirade, entirely unaware that the walls had ears and that the quiet wife was listening to every single word. Well, you do not have to worry about her much longer. The other girl giggled excitedly. You are basically the unofficial first lady of this logistics company anyway. Vanessa let out a loud, triumphant laugh that grated against my eardrums. Unofficial for now, she bragged, her voice dripping with supreme unchecked vanity. By the very end of this month, I will be the absolute legal wife. Derek and I have everything perfectly lined up. As soon as Victor Thorne signs the venture capital documents, we are completely gone. We are moving straight to Paris and leaving that pathetic little housewife buried under a massive mountain of toxic corporate debt. My hand moved with lightning speed and absolute silence. I pulled my smartphone from my leather purse and swiped quickly to the voice memo application. I pressed the red record button, holding the device close to the narrow gap in the wooden door to capture the audio with flawless, pristine clarity. I needed her to keep talking and bragging to her friends. I needed her to hang herself with her own incredibly arrogant tongue. And Vanessa, the absolute epitome of reckless vanity, eagerly delivered the exact evidence I required. The 2 girls gasped in feigned shock at her bold declaration. "Are you entirely serious?" Vanessa once asked in a hushed, dramatic whisper. "Is Derek really going to leave her with all the company liabilities and the bank loans? Is that not incredibly illegal? What if the federal auditors trace the missing money back to you guys?" Vanessa laughed again, a chilling, malicious sound that bounced off the marble walls. "Let them try and trace it," she boasted wildly, completely drunk on her own perceived brilliance. "I am the one who personally set up the 3 offshore shell corporations in the Cayman Islands. I spent the last 8 months generating completely fake public relations invoices and routing the stolen cash directly into my private holding company. Derek just signed the executive approvals, and I completely washed the funds through the international vendor accounts. We have already safely diverted over $12 million, and that naive idiot Ava never suspected a single thing. She literally balanced the corporate ledgers and handed us the cash without looking twice. She is so incredibly stupid it is almost pitiful to watch." The red recording dot on my screen pulsed with a steady, lethal rhythm. She had just provided a flawless, crystal-clear audio confession of grand larceny, wire fraud, and active criminal conspiracy. She had explicitly admitted on a digital recording to creating fraudulent invoices and managing illicit offshore accounts to actively rob the logistics company. This was the exact missing puzzle piece Maya needed to completely lock down the federal indictment and ensure Vanessa went to prison right alongside my treacherous husband. I felt a cold, brilliant fire igniting deep within my soul. The sheer poetic justice of her blinding arrogance was incredibly intoxicating to witness. "Well, cheers to Paris, then!" The girls chorused excitedly, gathering their things from the marble counter. "We will see you back out there, Vanessa. We need to go mingle before Derek wonders where we went." The heavy main doors opened and closed with a soft thud as the 2 subordinates exited the restroom, leaving Vanessa entirely alone to finish her vain preening. I waited exactly 10 seconds to ensure the hallway was clear. I carefully stopped the recording and instantly uploaded the massive audio file directly to my secure encrypted cloud server. The deadly evidence was locked away permanently. I slipped the phone back into my purse and smoothed the skirt of my beige dress. I took a deep breath, letting the freezing iron resolve pump rapidly through my veins. The terrified, humiliated woman Derek thought he married was officially dead and buried. I reached out and unlocked the stall door. The loud metal click echoed like a gunshot in the silent marble room. Vanessa violently jumped, dropping her expensive lipstick clattering onto the counter. She spun around, her eyes widening in absolute sheer terror as I stepped slowly out of the shadows. The rosy color instantly drained from her heavily contoured face, leaving her looking pale and sickly. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound came out. She was completely paralyzed, realizing I had been standing there the entire time listening to her confess to federal crimes. I did not scream at her. I did not lunge across the room or throw a pathetic, jealous tantrum. I walked over to the marble sink directly beside her, moving with the silent, terrifying grace of an apex predator. I turned on the gold faucet and began washing my hands with slow, methodical precision. I could feel Vanessa trembling beside me. The suffocating stench of her cheap floral perfume was entirely overwhelmed by the sharp, sour scent of her sudden absolute panic. You were in there," she finally stammered, her voice cracking pitifully under the crushing weight of her own guilt and sheer terror. She stared at me in the large mirror, fully expecting me to explode into furious tears or scream hysterically about the affair. I turned off the water and reached calmly for a paper towel. I dried my hands meticulously, taking my absolute time to let the agonizing silence stretch between us. I turned my head slowly and looked directly into her terrified, panicked eyes. I did not show a single ounce of anger or heartbreak. Instead, I forced the muscles in my face to relax completely. I offered her a soft, polite, and incredibly chilling smile. It was the exact smile of an executioner who had just finished sharpening the heavy guillotine blade. "It is a beautiful day for a corporate luncheon, Vanessa," I murmured, my voice incredibly low and remarkably steady. "You should really fix your lipstick. It is completely smudged across your chin. You would not want Derek to think you look incredibly sloppy in front of Victor Thorne today, would you?" I threw the crumpled paper towel into the trash bin and walked gracefully toward the exit. My sensible heels clicked with a steady, lethal rhythm against the marble floor. I did not look back at her a single time. I pushed the heavy doors open and walked back out into the noisy, crowded restaurant. I left her standing completely frozen by the sink, absolutely suffocated by cold dread and the terrifying sudden realization that the naive, submissive wife was not nearly as stupid as she had arrogantly assumed. The invisible steel cage was now fully locked, and they were both completely trapped inside, waiting for the ultimate devastation to begin. I sat entirely alone in the suffocating darkness of our master bedroom, illuminated only by the freezing cold blue glow of my smartphone screen. The massive house was dead quiet. Derek had returned from his lavish corporate luncheon and his secret rendezvous with Vanessa, completely drunk on his own perceived brilliance. I watched the live feed from the hidden camera disguised as a digital clock in his home office. He walked heavily into the frame, loosening his expensive silk tie and pouring himself a massive glass of premium scotch from his crystal decanter. He was the absolute picture of a man who firmly believed he had completely conquered the world. He sank deeply into his heavy leather reading chair, entirely oblivious to the tiny invisible lens capturing his every single movement. The air purifier camera and the artificial plant camera provided flawless alternate high-definition angles. The technological trap I had meticulously laid was holding perfectly still. My heart beat with a slow, deliberate, and incredibly lethal rhythm. I was a calculating hunter, waiting patiently in the dark blind, watching the arrogant prey step willingly onto the massive tripwire. Derek pulled his sleek personal smartphone from his tailored suit pocket and dialed a long, complex international number. I instantly maximized the audio feed, pressing my wireless earbud tightly against my ear to ensure I did not miss a single treacherous syllable. The connection clicked, and a thick, heavily accented voice answered on the other end. Derek leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His deeply arrogant posture was completely visible on the high-definition digital feed. "Listen to me very carefully," he ordered, his voice dripping with that familiar toxic condescension I had blindly endured for 5 long years. "The massive venture capital funds from Victor Thorne are officially clearing the primary domestic accounts on Friday morning. I need the Cayman Island holding companies perfectly primed and completely ready to receive the absolute maximum transfer limit the very second the money hits the main corporate ledger." There was a brief pause as the offshore banker replied with a hesitant question. Derek let out a harsh, cruel laugh that made my stomach churn with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Do not worry about the federal compliance regulations or the domestic banking authorities," Derek boasted wildly, waving his glass of scotch in the empty room. "My completely oblivious wife just signed the post-nuptial agreements today. She legally separated her entire financial profile from the company. She handed me the absolute keys to the kingdom without reading a single word. I am going to initiate a massive blind wire transfer directly through Vanessa and her completely fake public relations invoices. We will wash the entire $50 million through the Caribbean accounts before the domestic bank even registers the massive withdrawal. As soon as the transaction is successfully completed, I am filing a catastrophic Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The entire company will instantly dissolve, and I will be sitting on a private beach in Paris drinking champagne by the time the federal authorities even open an official investigation. You just make absolutely sure those international routing numbers are completely untraceable. I am not leaving a single dime behind for that pathetic, useless woman. I want her completely buried under the toxic corporate debt, so she cannot afford a single competent lawyer to fight back." The sheer magnitude of his malice was absolutely staggering, but I felt absolutely zero emotional pain. The heartbroken, naive girl who had wept over his betrayal was entirely erased from existence. I was now a strategic powerhouse holding the ultimate weapon of his complete destruction. As soon as Derek ended the call and tossed his phone onto the mahogany desk, I immediately hit the download button on my secure encrypted application. I watched the blue progress bar inch forward, pulling the flawless high-definition video and the crystal-clear audio directly into my private digital vault. The file contained his explicit verbal authorization of massive international money laundering, premeditated wire fraud, and intentional corporate bankruptcy manipulation. It was the absolute holy grail of federal criminal evidence. I saved the massive digital file and backed it up to 3 separate remote locations, ensuring Derek could never possibly delete his own fatal confession. My hands were incredibly steady as I verified the data integrity. I possessed the undeniable proof required to lock him in a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. I opened my highly secure messaging application and attached the explosive video file to a direct message addressed to Maya and Victor Thorne. I did not need to write a long emotional explanation or a dramatic victory speech. I simply typed a single cold, lethal sentence. The final nail is officially in the coffin. I pressed send and watched the digital envelope fly into the dark encrypted ether. Within seconds, 2 read receipts blinked onto my screen, followed instantly by a message from Maya. It read simply flawless execution. Victor followed a moment later with a message that sent a freezing thrill of pure absolute power straight down my spine. "The cage is locked," he wrote. The trap was now fully armed and heavily loaded. Derek had absolutely no idea that his entire stolen empire was built directly on top of a massive ticking time bomb. He would wake up tomorrow believing he was a billionaire mastermind destined for a glamorous new life. He would walk into the closing meeting with Victor Thorne wearing his most expensive suit and his most charming, deceitful smile. The agonizing wait was finally over. The invisible steel bars were firmly in place. All that remained was to stand back, watch him confidently step into the center of the room and ruthlessly pull the trigger. I locked my phone screen and placed the device gently onto my bedside table. I lay back against the cool cotton sheets, staring up at the dark ceiling. I listened to the faint muffled sound of Derek walking heavily up the stairs and stumbling into his separate guest bedroom down the hall. He was completely intoxicated by his own arrogance and the expensive liquor he had consumed while plotting my total ruin. He truly believed he had outsmarted everyone, including a brilliant corporate lawyer, a billionaire venture capitalist, and the very wife whose unwavering support had built his foundation. He thought I was sleeping peacefully, entirely ignorant of his impending escape. But I was wide awake, and my mind was sharper than a freshly honed blade. I closed my eyes and allowed a small, incredibly dark smile to touch my lips. Tomorrow would be the absolute greatest performance of my entire life. Tomorrow, the naive, submissive wife would officially die, and the woman who orchestrated his absolute downfall would rise from the ashes. The magnificent games of chess was essentially over, and I had already delivered the final devastating checkmate. The heavy glass doors of the executive boardroom glided open silently, revealing the absolute pinnacle of corporate vanity. This was the exact room where Derek had spent the last 5 years, taking completely unearned credit for my grueling sacrifices and endless late-night financial modeling. The sprawling space was dominated by a massive polished mahogany table that stretched the entire length of the room, gleaming brightly under the harsh recessed lighting. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding panoramic view of the entire city skyline, serving as the perfect dramatic backdrop for what Derek firmly believed would be his ultimate coronation. I walked into the room with perfectly measured steps, maintaining the flawless posture of the quiet, dutiful wife. My beige designer suit was completely understated, intentionally, chosen to make me blend seamlessly into the background. I took my designated seat near the far end of the massive table, folding my hands neatly in my lap. My exterior was the absolute picture of domestic submission, but my heart beat with a slow, freezing, and entirely lethal rhythm. The invisible cage was perfectly constructed, and I was now simply waiting for the oblivious prey to lock himself permanently inside. Derek stood at the very head of the polished mahogany table, radiating an almost blinding aura of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He wore a custom-tailored midnight black suit with a blood-red silk tie, perfectly matching the incredibly toxic vanity that drove his every single decision. He was practically vibrating with the sheer intoxicating thrill of his impending victory. He flashed his brilliant, charismatic smile at the various junior executives and legal partners filing into the room, treating them all like pathetic peasants, lucky enough to witness his absolute genius. He truly believed he had masterminded the perfect, massive corporate heist. He thought his fraudulent bankruptcy scheme and his illicit offshore bank accounts were completely untraceable. He had no idea that every single treacherous word he had spoken in his home office was currently sitting securely on an encrypted federal server. He looked at me down the length of the long table and offered a quick, patronizing nod. He honestly believed I was just a naive little workhorse entirely, and completely ignorant of the fact that he was about to steal $50 million and leave me drowning in toxic legal debt. Standing directly by his right side was Vanessa. The absolute sheer audacity of her presence in this highly secure executive meeting was physically nauseating to witness. She wore a scandalously tight emerald green dress that was wildly inappropriate for a high-stakes corporate acquisition. She leaned heavily against the back of Derek's leather chair, crossing her arms to emphasize her chest and casting completely smug, victorious smirks at anyone who made eye contact. The cloying, overwhelming stench of her cheap floral perfume drifted across the long mahogany table, threatening to completely choke the clean air out of the pristine room. She looked exactly like a woman who was already mentally spending stolen millions on private jets and Parisian shopping sprees. She truly thought she had completely defeated me. She thought she was replacing the tired, boring wife to become the glamorous, ultra-wealthy partner of a brilliant logistics billionaire. I watched her vain, pathetic preening with absolutely zero jealousy and zero anger. I only felt a freezing clinical satisfaction, knowing she was about to be federally indicted for massive wire fraud before she could even pack her expensive designer bags. The heavy double doors swung open one final time, and Victor Thorne walked into the silent boardroom. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted as the billionaire venture capitalist commanded the space with his terrifying apex predator energy. He wore a flawless charcoal suit, and his sharp dark eyes swept across the room with absolutely lethal precision. Derek immediately stood up straighter, buttoning his jacket and flashing his most charming, desperate smile. Victor did not return the pleasantry. He walked slowly to the opposite end of the mahogany table, sitting down heavily in the plush leather chair directly across from Derek. For one brief, imperceptible second, Victor's incredibly sharp gaze locked entirely onto mine. There was absolutely no nod, no smile, and no outward sign of our covert alliance. But in the freezing dark depths of his eyes, I saw the pure, ruthless confirmation I needed. The trap was fully armed. The highly aggressive convertible debt instruments were perfectly hidden within the massive stack of acquisition contracts currently resting inside his sleek black leather briefcase. We were completely ready to execute the flawless hostile corporate takeover. Gentlemen, Victor announced, his deep, resonant voice filling the silent room with absolute, unquestionable authority. We are here to finalize the $50 million capital injection into this logistics corporation. My legal team has fully prepared the binding agreements. I expect total transparency and absolute compliance moving forward. Derek nodded enthusiastically, his eyes practically glowing with unadulterated greed. Absolutely. Victor Derek boasted, his voice loud and incredibly arrogant. This partnership is going to completely revolutionize the entire maritime shipping industry. I have perfectly streamlined the internal operational pathways to ensure maximum immediate profitability. We are absolutely ready to scale this massive vision globally the very second the funds clear the primary domestic ledger. Victor pulled a thick stack of crisp, heavy legal documents from his briefcase and slid them precisely down the center of the polished mahogany table. The pristine white pages rested directly in front of Derek. The massive $50 million bait was officially placed entirely within his greedy, desperate reach. Vanessa leaned over Derek's shoulder, her eyes wide, with intoxicating raw avarice, completely unable to hide her pathetic excitement. Derek reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out his expensive silver fountain pen. I sat there watching the heavy silver pen catch the bright fluorescent light. Every single grueling night I had spent balancing his chaotic ledgers, every single humiliating insult I had quietly swallowed, and every single ounce of my stolen life was culminating in this exact precise moment. He adjusted his silk tie one final time, fully savoring the absolute spotlight he had craved his entire pathetic life. He believed he was a magnificent self-made titan of industry, entirely untouchable and completely victorious. The heavy mahogany table felt like an executioner's block, and I was the silent, unseen judge watching the heavy steel blades slowly begin to fall. Derek uncapped the silver pen and lowered the sharp metallic tip directly toward the pristine white paper, holding his breath in pure, arrogant anticipation. The heavy frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom glided open silently, revealing the absolute pinnacle of corporate vanity. This was the exact room where Derek had spent the last 5 years taking completely unearned credit for my grueling sacrifices and my endless late-night financial modeling. The sprawling space was dominated by a massive polished mahogany table that stretched the entire length of the room, gleaming brightly under the harsh recessed lighting. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding panoramic view of the entire city skyline, serving as the perfect dramatic backdrop for what Derek firmly believed would be his ultimate coronation. I walked into the room with perfectly measured steps, maintaining the flawless posture of the quiet, dutiful wife. My beige designer suit was completely understated, intentionally chosen to make me blend seamlessly into the background. I took my designated seat near the far end of the massive table, folding my hands neatly in my lap. My exterior was the absolute picture of domestic submission, but my heart beat with a slow, freezing, and entirely lethal rhythm. The invisible cage was perfectly constructed, and I was now simply waiting for the oblivious prey to lock himself permanently inside. Derek stood at the very head of the polished mahogany table, radiating an almost blinding aura of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He wore a custom-tailored midnight black suit with a blood-red silk tie perfectly matching the incredibly toxic vanity that drove his every single decision. He was practically vibrating with the sheer intoxicating thrill of his impending victory. He flashed his brilliant, charismatic smile at the various junior executives and legal partners filing into the room, treating them all like pathetic peasants, lucky enough to witness his absolute genius. He truly believed he had masterminded the perfect massive corporate heist. He thought his fraudulent bankruptcy scheme and his illicit offshore bank accounts were completely untraceable. He had no idea that every single treacherous word he had spoken in his home office was currently sitting securely on an encrypted federal server. He looked at me down the length of the long table and offered a quick, patronizing nod. He honestly believed I was just a naive little workhorse entirely and completely ignorant of the fact that he was about to steal $50 million and leave me drowning in toxic legal debt. Standing directly by his right side was Vanessa. The absolute sheer audacity of her presence in this highly secure executive meeting was physically nauseating to witness. She wore a scandalously tight emerald green dress that was wildly inappropriate for a high-stakes corporate acquisition. She leaned heavily against the back of Derek's leather chair, crossing her arms to emphasize her chest, and casting completely smug, victorious smirks at anyone who made eye contact. The cloying, overwhelming stench of her cheap floral perfume drifted across the long mahogany table, threatening to completely choke the clean air out of the pristine room. She looked exactly like a woman who was already mentally spending stolen millions on private jets and Parisian shopping sprees. She truly thought she had completely defeated me. She thought she was replacing the tired, boring wife to become the glamorous, ultra-wealthy partner of a brilliant logistics billionaire. I watched her vain, pathetic preening with absolutely zero jealousy and zero anger. I only felt a freezing clinical satisfaction knowing she was about to be federally indicted for massive wire fraud before she could even pack her expensive designer bags. The heavy double doors swung open one final time, and Victor Thorne walked into the silent boardroom. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted as the billionaire venture capitalist commanded the space with his terrifying apex predator energy. He wore a flawless charcoal suit, and his sharp dark eyes swept across the room with absolutely lethal precision. Derek immediately stood up straighter, buttoning his jacket and flashing his most charming, desperate smile. Victor did not return the pleasantry. He walked slowly to the opposite end of the mahogany table, sitting down heavily in the plush leather chair directly across from Derek. For one brief, imperceptible second, Victor's incredibly sharp gaze locked entirely onto mine. There was absolutely no nod, no smile, and no outward sign of our covert alliance. But in the freezing dark depths of his eyes, I saw the pure, ruthless confirmation I needed. The trap was fully armed. The highly aggressive convertible debt instruments were perfectly hidden within the massive stack of acquisition contracts, currently resting inside his sleek black leather briefcase. We were completely ready to execute the flawless hostile corporate takeover. "Gentlemen!" Victor announced, his deep, resonant voice filling the silent room with absolute, unquestionable authority. "We are here to finalize the $50 million capital injection into this logistics corporation. My legal team has fully prepared the binding agreements. I expect total transparency and absolute compliance moving forward." Derek nodded enthusiastically, his eyes practically glowing with unadulterated greed. "Absolutely!" Victor Derek boasted, his voice loud and incredibly arrogant. This partnership is going to completely revolutionize the entire maritime shipping industry. I have perfectly streamlined the internal operational pathways to ensure maximum immediate profitability. We are absolutely ready to scale this massive vision globally the very second the funds clear the primary domestic ledger. Victor pulled a thick stack of crisp, heavy legal documents from his briefcase and slid them precisely down the center of the polished mahogany table. The pristine white pages rested directly in front of Derek. The massive $50 million bait was officially placed entirely within his greedy, desperate reach. Vanessa leaned over Derek's shoulder, her eyes wide with intoxicating raw avarice, completely unable to hide her pathetic excitement. Derek reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out his expensive silver fountain pen. I sat there watching the heavy silver pen catch the bright fluorescent light. Every single grueling night, I had spent balancing his chaotic ledgers, every single humiliating insult I had quietly swallowed, and every single ounce of my stolen life was culminating in this exact precise moment. He adjusted his silk tie one final time, fully savoring the absolute spotlight he had craved his entire pathetic life. He believed he was a magnificent self-made titan of industry, entirely untouchable and completely victorious. The heavy mahogany table felt like an executioner's block, and I was the silent, unseen judge watching the heavy steel blades slowly begin to fall. Derek uncapped the silver pen and lowered the sharp metallic tip directly toward the pristine white paper, holding his breath in pure, arrogant anticipation. The heavy silver tip of Derek's expensive fountain pen hovered exactly 1 millimeter above the crisp white signature line of the massive venture capital contract. The entire executive boardroom held its collective breath, completely captivated by the arrogant king preparing to officially seal his $50 million victory. I watched his smug, satisfied smile stretch across his handsome, deceitful face. This was the precise, magnificent second I had been waiting for. The spectacular climax of his intricately woven web of lies. Before the dark black ink could even stain the pristine paper, I stood up from my quiet, unassuming seat in the distant corner of the room. The sudden movement caught the attention of the junior executives, but I did not stop. I walked forward with slow, perfectly measured steps. The soft clicking of my modest beige heels echoed like rhythmic gunshots against the polished hardwood floor, breaking the suffocating silence of the massive corporate chamber. Derek paused, his silver pen freezing mid-air. He looked up at me with a sharp flash of genuine irritation, completely annoyed that his pathetic, domesticated wife was interrupting his ultimate moment of unearned glory. "Ava," he snapped, his voice dripping with harsh, condescending warning, "go sit down immediately. We are conducting incredibly sensitive official business here, and you are ruining the ceremonial closing." I did not sit down. I did not apologize or shrink back into the invisible shadows. I continued walking directly toward the head of the polished mahogany table, radiating an absolutely freezing aura of pure lethal authority. As I reached the center of the room, the heavy double doors at the far end swung open with a resounding thud. Maya strode into the boardroom wearing her immaculate emerald green power suit and carrying a sleek silver laptop. She moved with the terrifying grace of an apex predator, completely ignoring the shocked gasps of the legal partners. Simultaneously, Victor Thorne slowly stood up from his plush leather chair at the opposite end of the table. He buttoned his charcoal suit jacket and walked deliberately around the massive table to stand directly by my right side. Maya took her position firmly on my left. We formed an impenetrable wall of absolute corporate devastation. Derek stared at the three of us, his arrogant smirk faltering for the very first time. He looked from Maya to Victor and finally to me, his bloodshot eyes widening in profound confusion. "Victor, what is the meaning of this?" Derek demanded, his voice wavering with the first subtle notes of genuine panic. "Why is my sister here interrupting my closing meeting?" Victor did not answer him. He simply crossed his arms over his chest and looked at Derek with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist observing a dying insect. I completely bypassed my entirely bewildered husband. I walked straight past his freezing form and approached the main presentation podium. I took the silver laptop from Maya's steady hands and placed it firmly onto the podium. I reached down and grabbed the primary display cable, plugging it seamlessly into the side of the sleek computer. The massive floor-to-ceiling digital projector screen at the front of the boardroom instantly hummed to life, casting a stark, brilliant white glow across the entire stunned room. "There is a slight administrative error in your paperwork, Derek," I stated clearly, my voice echoing with a calm, terrifyingly even tone that demanded absolute silence. "You see, you are attempting to legally sign away $50 million of venture capital funding on behalf of a logistics corporation that you no longer actually control." Vanessa let out a sharp, hysterical laugh from her position behind Derek's chair. "Are you completely insane, Ava?" she mocked loudly, crossing her arms and sticking out her chest. "Derek is the sole chief executive officer. You are just a pathetic bored housewife who organizes his sock drawer. Somebody call corporate security and drag this crazy woman out of the building." I did not even look at her. I simply tapped the spacebar on my laptop keyboard. The giant digital screen behind me instantly shifted. The crisp white background was completely replaced by a massive high-definition display of the true, unedited corporate balance sheets. The real ledgers. The gasps from the senior board members and the legal partners were entirely immediate and incredibly loud. The numbers blaring on the screen were colored in deep, catastrophic red. They showed the massive, gaping financial holes Derek had secretly carved into the foundational company capital. I tapped the keyboard again. The screen instantly divided into 3 separate sections. The left panel displayed the completely falsified profit margins Derek had presented to the board just last week. The center panel displayed the true, devastated internal revenue reports. The right panel displayed a perfectly organized list of incredibly complex international wire transfers. Every single transfer was routed directly to 3 untraceable shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands. "What you are looking at, gentlemen," I announced, my voice projecting clearly over the rising chaotic murmurs of the horrified executives, "is the absolute undeniable proof of massive premeditated corporate fraud. Over the past 8 months, Derek has systematically embezzled $12 million from the primary domestic accounts and secretly funneled those exact funds into illicit offshore holding companies." Derek slammed his hands down onto the mahogany table, his face turning a violent shade of crimson. "That is a complete and total lie," he roared, his voice cracking with sheer desperate panic. "Those documents are entirely fabricated. She hacked my computer and completely forged those numbers to ruin my reputation because she is a jealous, hysterical woman." I pressed the spacebar one more time. The massive screen shifted again. This time, it displayed the pristine, high-definition video footage I had captured just last night from the hidden clock camera in his home office. Derek's face, 10 feet tall, filled the entire wall. The crystal-clear audio blasted through the expensive boardroom speakers, capturing his exact treacherous words with flawless precision. "I am going to initiate a massive blind wire transfer directly through Vanessa and her completely fake public relations invoices," his recorded voice boasted, wildly echoing off the mahogany walls. "We will wash the entire $50 million through the Caribbean accounts before the domestic bank even registers the massive withdrawal. As soon as the transaction is successfully completed, I am filing a catastrophic Chapter 11 bankruptcy." The entire boardroom descended into absolute deathly silence. The air was completely sucked out of the room. The senior board members stared at the massive screen in pure, unadulterated horror. The legal partners furiously began shoving their documents into their briefcases, physically backing away from the table to entirely distance themselves from the radioactive criminal conspiracy. Vanessa stumbled backward, her emerald green dress suddenly looking incredibly foolish as the blood completely drained from her heavily contoured face. She raised her trembling hands to her mouth, realizing her incredibly arrogant boasts in the ladies' restroom were no longer her only fatal vulnerability. She had just been explicitly named as a primary co-conspirator in a massive federal money laundering operation. Derek stood completely paralyzed, his jaw hanging open as he stared at his own giant face, confessing to federal crimes. The heavy silver fountain pen slipped from his sweaty, trembling fingers and clattered loudly onto the polished wood. "You cannot do this to me," Derek stammered wildly, his arrogant facade entirely shattering into a million jagged pieces. "You have absolutely no legal authority here, Ava. I am the majority shareholder. I am the sole owner of this entire corporate empire. I will have you arrested for illegal surveillance and corporate espionage." I offered him a soft, polite, and incredibly chilling smile. I turned back to the laptop and tapped a final key. The massive screen wiped the video away and replaced it with a crystal-clear scanned image of the blue post-nuptial agreement he had eagerly signed just yesterday morning in our pristine kitchen. I magnified the very last page, highlighting his bold slashing signature right next to mine. I then magnified the dense legal paragraphs hidden deeply within the center of the document. I specifically highlighted the crucial section in bright glowing yellow. I actually do have the absolute legal authority. Derek, I explained, my voice remaining incredibly smooth and entirely devoid of any meaningless anger. Because you were far too arrogant and far too eager to steal $50 million, you completely failed to read the actual fine print of the document your submissive, naive wife handed you. You did not sign a post-nuptial agreement separating my marital assets. You actually signed a highly binding, aggressive corporate poison pill drafted by your own brilliant sister, Maya. Maya's voice cut through the silent room, sharp and lethal as a drawn blade. The contract you signed explicitly states that in the incredibly likely event of documented financial fraud, massive embezzlement, or gross corporate mismanagement perpetrated by you, total and absolute ownership of your voting shares immediately and irrevocably transfers directly to Ava. I looked directly into Derek's terrified, panicked eyes, watching the absolute realization of his complete destruction slowly wash over his freezing face. As of yesterday morning, Derek Thivray stated coldly, I own 68% of this entire logistics corporation. You are no longer the chief executive officer. You are no longer a majority shareholder. You have absolutely no executive power, no corporate access, and zero legal standing in this room. But the investment, Derek choked out, turning his desperate, pleading eyes toward Victor Thorne. Victor, you saw the potential here. We can still execute the massive domestic expansion. You cannot let this crazy, bitter woman ruin a $50 million venture capital acquisition. Victor Thorne let out a low, terrifying chuckle that completely sealed my husband's absolute doom. You fundamentally misunderstand the entire situation. Derek, Victor replied, his deep voice radiating pure, predatory satisfaction. Ava is not ruining the acquisition. She completely orchestrated the entire thing. I never had a single intention of funding your pathetic criminal enterprise. Ava came to me with the true ledgers. We purposefully built this entire elaborate stage today, simply to lock you inside the cage. You are a massive liability, and I only partner with brilliant strategic powerhouses like your incredible wife. Derek staggered backward, his knees actually buckling until he collapsed heavily into his large leather chair. He looked completely hollowed out, a pathetic broken shell of the arrogant king he pretended to be. He had completely built his own massive coffin and eagerly hammered the nails in himself. I turned back to the shocked board of directors, leaning my hands firmly onto the podium. Gentlemen, I announced, my voice ringing with total, uncompromising authority. As the new majority shareholder and acting chief executive officer of this corporation, my very first official directive is the immediate termination of Derek and Vanessa for gross ethical violations and massive financial fraud. My second official directive is to hand this entire digital portfolio of criminal evidence directly over to the federal authorities, who are currently waiting downstairs in the main lobby. I closed the silver laptop with a sharp, definitive snap. I looked at Derek one final time, completely stripping away the last remaining shred of his pathetic power. You are officially dismissed, Derek. Get out of my boardroom. The incredibly heavy silence in the boardroom was absolutely suffocating as Victor Thorne delivered his final lethal statement. I watched with pure, freezing satisfaction as the rich, healthy color completely and utterly drained from Derek's arrogant face. His sun-kissed complexion transformed into a sickly, terrifying shade of pale gray in a matter of seconds. The smug, triumphant grin that had lived on his lips for the past 5 years melted away entirely, leaving behind a pathetic, gaping expression of sheer, unadulterated horror. He stared at Victor as if the billionaire venture capitalist had just physically struck him across the face with a heavy iron bar. His brain was violently struggling to process the impossible reality unfolding directly in front of him. Victor did not break eye contact for a single second. The titan of finance sat perfectly still in his plush leather chair, radiating an absolutely lethal, predatory dominance that completely paralyzed my deceitful husband. I am not investing a single dime in you, Derek. Victor stated, his deep, resonant voice echoing off the polished mahogany walls. "I am fully backing Ava in this hostile corporate takeover and ensuring that your completely fraudulent empire is permanently dismantled." Derek gripped the edge of the massive mahogany table so tightly that his knuckles turned completely stark white. His expensive silver fountain pen remained abandoned on the polished wood, a useless metallic relic of his failed criminal conspiracy. "You cannot do this!" he gasped, his voice cracking and breaking under the immense crushing pressure of his impending absolute ruin. "I am the chief executive officer. I built this entire logistics company from the ground up. You are legally stealing my entire life." He was shouting now, his voice echoing with a frantic, highly pathetic desperation. The junior executives and legal partners who had worshipped him just 10 minutes ago were now actively physically backing away from the table. They pressed themselves firmly against the floor-to-ceiling windows, entirely desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of his massive failure. Derek looked frantically around the room, entirely unable to comprehend how his incredibly perfect heist had suddenly transformed into a spectacular public execution. He turned his wild, bloodshot eyes back toward Victor. "Victor, please, you have to listen to me," Derek begged violently, abandoning his arrogant facade and completely degrading himself in front of the entire corporate board. "I can fix the offshore accounts. I can completely reverse the corporate bankruptcy filings. We can still make hundreds of millions of dollars together. You do not need her. She is just a naive, useless housewife who knows absolutely nothing about running a massive global corporation." Victor simply leaned back in his heavy leather chair, completely disgusted by the pathetic, groveling man standing before him. He did not even dignify Derek's desperate whining with a verbal response. The silence from the billionaire was incredibly loud and utterly devastating. Derek finally realized that Victor Thorne was entirely impenetrable. The absolute terror in his eyes shifted, and he slowly turned his frantic gaze toward me. I stood perfectly still at the front of the boardroom, radiating an incredibly cold, undeniable boss energy. I did not flinch or look away, as he staggered toward me like a severely wounded animal. "Ava, please, Derek," whimpered, his voice dropping into a sickeningly sweet, manipulative tone that made my stomach physically churn with pure revulsion. "You know I love you. You know I only did all of this to protect our future together. That post-nuptial agreement was a complete mistake. We can tear it up right now. We can go back home and fix our marriage. You do not want to destroy the man you love, do you?" I looked down at him, feeling absolutely zero pity and zero lingering affection. The pathetic, weak man begging for his corporate life was completely unrecognizable to me. I simply offered him a freezing clinical smile that contained absolutely no warmth and no forgiveness. "Our marriage ended the very second you forged my signature to steal millions of dollars, Derek," I stated clearly, my voice ringing with total, uncompromising authority. "You are going to face the absolute maximum consequences for every single treacherous decision you made, and I am going to watch you lose absolutely everything you value." As soon as those final lethal words left my lips, the heavy double doors of the executive boardroom flew completely open. The loud, forceful bang echoed like thunder throughout the massive glass and steel chamber. 4 highly trained federal investigators strode purposefully into the room. They wore dark tactical jackets emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Their faces were carved from solid granite, completely devoid of any emotion or hesitation. Maya stood directly behind them, her arms crossed firmly over her emerald green power suit, watching her incredibly flawless legal trap officially spring completely shut. She had perfectly timed their arrival to coincide exactly with the ultimate climax of our massive corporate ambush, ensuring the absolute maximum level of psychological devastation. The lead federal agent walked directly toward the head of the mahogany table, completely ignoring the shocked gasps of the remaining board members. Derek Thompson, the agent, announced, his voice loud and incredibly authoritative. "We have federal warrants for your immediate arrest on multiple felony counts of massive international wire fraud, severe tax evasion, and premeditated corporate embezzlement." Derek stumbled backward, violently colliding with his heavy leather chair. The absolute sheer terror completely overtook his entire physical body. He raised his trembling hands in a futile, pathetic gesture of surrender. "No, there is a massive misunderstanding," he cried out, his voice completely shrill and panicked. "I am a highly respected corporate executive. You cannot simply walk in here and arrest me based on forged digital evidence. My legal team will destroy you in federal court. I demand to speak with my attorneys right this very second." The federal agents did not hesitate for a single second. Two robust officers stepped forward and grabbed Derek's arms, twisting them firmly behind his back. The sharp metallic clicking sound of the heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists was the absolute greatest symphony I had ever heard in my entire life. It was the undeniable sound of total, absolute justice finally being served. Derek struggled and thrashed against their iron grip, crying out for his lawyers and demanding his immediate release, but his pathetic resistance was entirely useless. He was completely trapped in the very nightmare he had maliciously designed for me. Standing directly behind the violently struggling man was Vanessa, the incredibly arrogant woman who had openly mocked my appearance and aggressively boasted about becoming a billionaire wife, was now completely paralyzed by sheer, unadulterated dread. Her heavily contoured face was covered in a thick layer of cold, panicked sweat, causing her expensive makeup to run down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. The incredibly cloying stench of her cheap floral perfume mixed entirely with the sharp, sour smell of her sudden absolute terror. The horrifying reality of the situation was finally crashing down heavily upon her narrow shoulders. She had explicitly confessed on a high-definition audio recording to actively creating fraudulent corporate invoices and illegally managing offshore Caribbean bank accounts. The massive $50 million venture capital fund was completely gone, and the federal authorities were standing right inside the room, preparing to completely destroy her entire existence. The lead federal agent turned his sharp, intense gaze entirely onto her. "Vanessa Sterling," the agent stated, pulling a second heavy document from his jacket pocket. "We also have a federal warrant for your immediate arrest on multiple counts of active criminal conspiracy and international money laundering." Vanessa let out a piercing, completely hysterical shriek that violently shattered the remaining silence in the massive boardroom. Her entire arrogant facade instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces. She did not attempt to maintain her composure or display any false corporate dignity. She instantly turned her pure, venomous rage directly onto the man who had promised her the entire world. She lunged forward with her hands raised wildly, attempting to physically strike Derek right in the middle of his federal arrest, completely losing her absolute mind. "You absolutely lying, pathetic bastard!" Vanessa screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, her voice cracking and breaking with sheer, furious panic. "You completely promised me we were entirely safe. You swore the offshore shell corporations were totally untraceable. You completely ruined my entire life, Derek. You dragged me into this massive criminal scheme, and now I am going to federal prison because you are an incredibly stupid, incompetent failure who could not even control his own naive, pathetic wife." Derek flinched aggressively, trying to pull away from her violent thrashing as the federal agents quickly stepped in to forcibly separate them. "Shut your mouth!" Vanessa Derek shouted back, his face entirely red with fury and absolute humiliation. "You are the one who managed the fake public relations invoices. You were completely thrilled to steal the corporate money and fund your lavish, disgusting lifestyle. You are incredibly greedy, and you completely deserve absolutely everything that is happening to you right now." The incredibly chaotic scene was a flawless masterpiece of pure destructive karma. The two toxic, narcissistic betrayers, who had secretly plotted to completely destroy my innocent life, were now actively tearing each other apart in front of the entire corporate board. They were viciously turning on one another, desperately throwing blame, and completely exposing their true vile natures for the entire world to witness. The federal agents quickly overpowered Vanessa's hysterical resistance, violently twisting her arms behind her back and snapping a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs tightly around her wrists. She continued to sob uncontrollably, mascara streaming down her pale face, completely wailing about her completely ruined future and her impending massive federal sentence. I stood incredibly still at the very front of the boardroom, standing shoulder to shoulder with Victor Thorne and Maya. I watched the incredibly pathetic, deeply satisfying spectacle unfold, with absolute freezing clinical detachment. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy for the weeping woman or the desperately shouting man. They had intentionally designed an incredibly cruel, invisible prison for me, and now they were both securely locked completely inside it. The incredibly heavy oak doors of the executive boardroom were pulled wide open by the supporting officers. The federal agents began marching the completely humiliated couple out of the massive glass and steel chamber. As Derek was forcibly dragged past the central presentation podium, he completely stopped struggling for one tiny brief second. He turned his head and looked directly into my eyes. All the massive arrogance, all the cruel toxic vanity, and all the incredibly manipulative charm was completely entirely gone. There was absolutely nothing left inside his empty eyes except pure, unadulterated freezing terror and the incredibly heavy crushing realization of his absolute total defeat. He finally understood that the quiet, naive, domesticated wife had completely mathematically outsmarted him at every single complex turn. He finally realized that he had completely orchestrated his own massive public execution. I did not offer him a final emotional speech or a dramatic angry farewell. I simply maintained my incredibly cold, flawless posture and offered him a tiny, almost imperceptible tilt of my chin. It was the absolute, silent, devastating acknowledgement of my complete, total victory. The federal agents shoved him aggressively forward, marching him and his heavily sobbing mistress straight out into the long corporate hallway. The heavy double doors swung completely shut behind them, plunging the massive executive boardroom back into a state of stunned, profound silence. The absolute ruin of Derek and Vanessa was completely finalized, and my beautiful, flawless, incredibly ruthless vengeance was entirely complete. The heavy oak doors of the executive boardroom clicked shut, sealing the absolute ruin of the man who had completely underestimated me. I stood perfectly still at the front of the massive mahogany table, breathing in the incredibly clean and suddenly peaceful air. For 5 grueling years, I had quietly balanced his chaotic ledgers and swallowed his arrogant insults while he slowly bled my spirit dry. He truly believed I was nothing more than a naive domestic servant completely blind to his toxic betrayals and his massive financial fraud. But karma is an incredibly patient and meticulous auditor, and it absolutely never misses a target address. In the weeks that immediately followed that spectacular corporate ambush, the entire logistics empire Derek had arrogantly claimed as his own was entirely restructured under my absolute legal control. I sat in his massive corner office and watched with freezing clinical satisfaction as the federal indictment officially dismantled his completely fraudulent life piece. By incredibly pathetic piece. Derek did not go quietly into the dark night. He spent the first few months desperately fighting the massive federal charges, actively draining the absolute last remnants of his hidden personal savings on expensive defense attorneys, who secretly knew his case was entirely hopeless. When the trial finally commenced in the crowded downtown federal courthouse, I sat in the front row wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit and a completely impassive expression. I watched his highly expensive lawyers helplessly attempt to explain away the crystal clear audio recordings and the flawless video evidence I had meticulously gathered. It was an absolute slaughter. The federal prosecutors methodically stripped away his arrogant facade, entirely exposing him as nothing more than a greedy, incompetent thief who had actively conspired to rob his own company and destroy his incredibly loyal wife. When the federal judge finally handed down the official sentence, Derek physically collapsed into his heavy wooden chair. He was explicitly ordered to serve a full decade in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The heavy wooden gavel struck the block loudly, completely, sealing his absolute doom. He was officially stripped of all his corporate titles and completely forced into total personal financial bankruptcy to pay the massive federal restitution fines. He was left with absolutely nothing but a cheap orange jumpsuit and the agonizing memory of his own incredible stupidity. Vanessa suffered an equally devastating and completely self-inflicted tragic ending. The very same afternoon, she was hauled out of my boardroom in heavy steel handcuffs. She was officially terminated from her lucrative public relations position. The massive public scandal entirely destroyed her carefully constructed social reputation. The elite, wealthy circles she had so desperately tried to infiltrate instantly turned their backs on her, treating her like an incredibly toxic disease. She was entirely socially condemned and publicly humiliated, completely mocked by the very same junior executives she used to arrogantly brag to at expensive corporate luncheons when she faced her own severe legal battles for active criminal conspiracy and massive wire fraud. She desperately turned to Derek for financial and emotional support. She completely expected the man who had promised her Paris and private jets to pay for her criminal defense team. But Derek completely abandoned her instantly and violently blaming her for the entire fraudulent scheme in a pathetic attempt to reduce his own federal prison sentence. He threw her directly under the massive legal bus without a single second of hesitation, proving once again that there is absolutely no honor among greedy, self-serving thieves. Vanessa was left entirely alone, drowning in a massive mountain of legal debt and facing years of incredibly strict federal probation. Her incredibly arrogant dreams of Paris shopping sprees and billionaire status were completely reduced to ashes. She was forced to move into a tiny, miserable apartment on the absolute outskirts of the city, completely stripped of her designer wardrobe and her toxic vanity. I watched their magnificent downfall from the absolute pinnacle of the corporate ladder, feeling absolutely zero pity for their incredibly tragic endings they had maliciously conspired to steal my entire fortune and leave me completely broken and utterly humiliated. They had completely poisoned my home with their cheap floral perfume and their toxic, deceitful lies. They truly thought they were the smartest people in the entire world. But the greedy and the arrogant always completely construct their own elaborate traps. They were both entirely blinded by their own massive vanity, completely failing to see the quiet, incredibly intelligent woman standing right in front of them, carefully documenting their every single crime. Their absolute destruction was entirely self-inflicted, and it was a beautiful masterpiece of pure, undeniable justice. They had eagerly dug a massive, incredibly deep grave, intending to bury me alive, but they had completely fallen into the dark hole. Themselves, I walked out of the downtown federal courthouse on the final day of the trial, feeling incredibly light and entirely free. The suffocating weight of Derek's endless emotional manipulation was officially gone, completely replaced by a freezing steel resolve. The woman who had quietly baked his casseroles and organized his sock drawer was entirely dead and buried. I returned to the massive logistics corporation not as a silent, submissive wife, but as the absolute, undisputed chief executive officer. The incredibly massive corporate empire was now entirely mine to completely command. I spent the next several months entirely cleaning out the toxic rot Derek had left behind, hiring brilliant executives who actually possessed genuine corporate integrity. Victor Thorne finalized his massive venture capital investment, completely securing our total market dominance and validating my flawless strategic vision. Karma had flawlessly delivered the exact brutal consequences they completely deserved, and it absolutely never missed a single target address. I was finally standing entirely in the bright, warm sunlight, completely free to actively build an incredibly brilliant future, rising magnificently from the dark, miserable ashes of Derek's entirely destroyed logistics empire, completely on my own absolute magnificent triumphant terms. 1 week after the federal authorities escorted Derek out of the executive boardroom, I stepped out of the private elevator and walked onto the top floor of the corporate headquarters. The massive glass doors parted smoothly into a pristine space that was now legally mine. I did not wear the muted beige fabrics or the conservative flats that I used to hide behind. Today I wore a flawless tailored ivory suit and incredibly sharp stilettos that echoed with a firm, steady rhythm against the polished marble floors. I walked directly past the hushed, incredibly respectful whispers of the senior staff and stepped into the sprawling corner office. The heavy mahogany desk where Derek had plotted my financial ruin was completely gone. In its place sat a sleek, modern glass desk that perfectly reflected the brilliant morning sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I placed my leather briefcase down, gently smoothed the fabric of my jacket. I was officially the chief executive officer and the absolute majority shareholder of a highly lucrative global logistics empire. My personal wealth and all of my marital assets were entirely legally secured, completely locked behind an impenetrable fortress of incredibly aggressive corporate law. The suffocating anxiety and the constant freezing terror of the past 5 years were completely erased from my existence. I had meticulously scrubbed the toxic rot from the corporate ledgers, and purged every single disloyal executive who had blindly followed Derek's fraudulent commands. I was no longer a silent, submissive victim waiting for the inevitable slaughter. I was the absolute architect of my incredibly magnificent and beautiful destiny. I walked slowly across the expansive office and pushed open the heavy glass door leading out onto the balcony. The crisp, clean morning air washed over my face, carrying the faint, distant hum of the bustling city streets far below. I leaned my hands firmly against the cool metal railing, looking out over the magnificent sprawling skyline of downtown Manhattan. I took a deep, fulfilling breath entirely, soaking in the absolute freedom of my new reality. The naive, heartbroken woman who used to desperately seek validation from a completely deceitful man was officially dead and buried. In her place stood a brilliant, calculating powerhouse who had mathematically outsmarted a greedy narcissist and entirely destroyed his fraudulent empire. I watched the golden sunlight reflect brilliantly off the massive glass skyscrapers, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace settling deeply into my bones. The dark, miserable ashes of my ruined marriage had completely blown away on the wind, leaving behind a perfectly clear canvas for me to rebuild upon. I had completely reclaimed my stolen youth and my brilliant financial intellect. I had entirely proven that true strength does not require loud, meaningless screaming or desperate, jealous tantrums. True strength requires pure, freezing calculation and the absolute, ruthless patience to wait for the exact perfect moment to strike. I had survived the absolute worst betrayal imaginable, and I had emerged entirely victorious, entirely whole, and completely free. The soft sound of this glass door sliding open broke the morning silence. I knew exactly who stepped onto the balcony. The calm apex predator energy of Victor Thorne was unmistakable. He walked up beside me, resting his hands on the railing and looking out at the breathtaking panoramic view of the city. He wore a tailored dark navy suit, radiating the quiet authority of a man who owned the world. We stood together in comfortable silence, sharing the peaceful atmosphere. "You redesigned the entire executive floor," Victor murmured, his resonant voice smooth and devoid of any corporate aggression. "It looks significantly better without the overwhelming stench of cheap scotch and toxic vanity polluting the air." I turned my head, looking directly into his sharp, dark eyes. I found absolutely zero pity and zero patronizing arrogance looking back at me. I only saw pure, unadulterated respect and genuine, profound admiration for the brilliant woman standing right beside him. "We are building a transparent and highly efficient corporate foundation, Victor," I replied, keeping my voice steady and confident. "I require absolute clarity." Victor reached out slowly and gently placed his warm, strong hand directly over mine on the cool metal railing. The simple touch sent a brilliant, undeniable spark of genuine electricity racing straight through my veins. It was the firm, steady anchor of a true equal partner. "We have all the time in the world to build exactly what we want." "Ava," he said, offering a small, rare smile that melted the freezing ice in my chest. I looked out at the brilliant city skyline, feeling the truly beautiful and incredibly warm beginnings of a genuine romance, finally taking deep root. The spectacular game of chess was officially over, and my victorious new life was finally beginning. Women can sacrifice, but we should never be foolish. We pour our hearts into building a secure foundation and trusting the men we deeply love. But that pure trust must never ever become a blindfold. When a toxic narcissist decides to mistake your quiet grace for total weakness, and when you are completely backed into a dark corner, you must stand up and show them your true strength. You have to meticulously calculate your next move and absolutely unleash a flawless storm of undeniable justice. You are the true architect of your own beautiful destiny, and nobody can ever take that immense power away from you. The dark ashes of a broken marriage are simply the perfect fertilizer for a brilliant, triumphant new life. If you feel satisfied with this ending and enjoyed watching a deceitful man completely fall, please give me a like and subscribe to the channel. I love hearing from all of my amazing listeners completely around the entire world. What time is it where you are watching this video, and where are you from? Let me know in the comments below. Remember to protect your heart and never let anyone extinguish your brilliant, magnificent fire today.